Good morning. Good morning, everyone in the room. I hope you enjoyed yesterday evening, those of you who attended the dinner. I think that was definitely enjoyable. And those of you who have spent the night somewhere else in Bergen, I hope you enjoyed that as well. And I also welcome all the people online. I don't know, you probably also enjoyed your evenings. We have today, and I'm happy that you're here and contributing, we have the 5th day, actually, depending on how you count, 6th day or even 7th day for some of us, day of the conference. So it gets to a point where you think, oh, this can go on forever. Well, we have the session 12, Improving Pathways for Delivery of Multidisciplinary Ocean Observations into Marine Assessments Across Multiple Scales. The idea is observation, decision-making. So you need to develop observation systems, and you need to translate what comes out of that so that it becomes relevant for the decision-making, so the observation through to the assessment, to the decision-making. And we have a lot of very, very good examples that are presented throughout the session. I want to acknowledge my co-conveners who unfortunately can't be here, Karen Evans, Gabrielle Canonico, and India Hodgson-Johnston. I know that Karen and India are online available, so let's see how that goes. And that same is for most of our online speakers. So please use the Hoover app to ask questions to all of the presenters, but specifically to the online presenters. We also have 3 invited speakers. One of them, the first one, Michelle, will present in person here. The other 2 ones are online only. We have Martiny and Patricia Miloslavich. I want to already congratulate Patricia because she will present here, or we will play the video at 12:15. And she will be available online, so you can directly ask questions through the Hoover app. She will be awake, even though at 3 a.m. in the morning where she lives. So that's dedication. So without further ado, we have a full program. We have the break at 10:30, and then after the coffee break, we run the whole way through to 1 o'clock. So we have 15 minutes at the very end, either to use it as a buffer for all the presentations that are running over. I hope not. But other than that, we have a little bit of time for a general discussion if we want to dive into that. So without further ado, Michelle, please take the stage.
Yes, last session, morning after the conference dinner, so thank you for being here. Before I start, I want to take a minute and say that IMOS as a program acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and sea country that we operate on, and we recognize their special connection to land and sea, and also recognize them as Australia's first ocean observers. So I'm going to talk to you today about how we go from ocean observing through to trying to deliver benefit for Australia. To do that, I need to introduce the program that I'm talking about, which is Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System, or IMOS. We are a capability funded by the Commonwealth Government in Australia as a research infrastructure. We're a collaboration of 7 major partners and 4 associate participants led out of the University of Tasmania. Now, I said we're a research infrastructure. What that means is we don't do research in our program. What we do is we collect the data for people who are doing research and making decisions and following on from the data that we're collecting. So we effectively have a goal to deliver benefits through undertaking systematic, sustained observing of our very vast and valuable marine estate. What does that mean? We have an observing program that includes over 60 different infrastructure platforms that we operate around the country. So everything from deep water moorings in the Southern Ocean, one of the only of its kind in the area, Argo profiling floats of various flavors. We have underwater vehicles like ocean gliders. We use ships of opportunity, satellite remote sensing, wave buoys, and other moored sensor arrays, as well as animal tracking through acoustic telemetry, tracking of commercially and recreational important species, and animal-borne sensors where we're having animals collect oceanographic data for us. All of the data that's collected through this program is brought in and made openly available through our data center, the Australian Ocean Data Network. And what that means is we're functioning as a resource for anyone who wants to use our data to help with their work. Let me give you a little bit of context on ocean observing globally. This is a map of the regional alliances in the global ocean observing system. And you can see that we're not quite covering the whole of the planet yet. But IMOS links up with a range of other regional alliances in our area. But we function as a nation as a single regional alliance. And as you can see, there's a reasonably large box there that we're responsible. Australia's ocean territory, our exclusive economic zone, is actually twice the size of our landmass. So as a program, we have a lot of area to try to cover in this program. If we look at that in a slightly different way, this is some of the observations that are coming in through IMOS to give you some context for how this program operates and what the extent of it is. So the yellow you see on here are Argo float profiles, the orange are ships of opportunity tracks, the green are animal-borne sensor tracks, and then the red are places where we have fixed or moored infrastructure. This will give you an idea how extensive this program is, and that it's not just a national program, that we are contributing to our region and we're contributing to the global programs as well. Now, as we try to understand ocean observing benefits, we in this room all understand, that this helps us understand the state and the trend and what's happening with things and where things are going. But to make links to decision makers, we need to understand the places where we can have impact with them or where we can create benefit. Some of these are pretty obvious, so things like scientific impact and training and education. There are others like economic and community benefits where we can help support the blue economy, we can drive technology and innovation, and create societal benefit in a range of different areas. IMOS as a program is designed around creating societal benefit, and we've identified 5 areas where we think our program can provide and support to create benefit in Australia. You can see them here on the screen. They range from marine sovereignty and safety through to energy and food security, biodiversity conservation, and supporting coastal populations. In addition to trying to drive benefit in those particular areas, the data we collect also clusters up into a number of themes. Those are related to climate research, ocean management and knowledge generation, and also helping support operational services. So people like the Navy or maritime industries who need to make decisions about how they're going to operate on the water. And what we're trying to achieve is that the data and observations that we're collecting are relevant to these people. We partner with them to help meet their needs and enable outcomes through their use of our data. We do that by planning for use and benefit. So using Argo as an example, we know Argo data are taken up into a range of different models and a range of different programs. And so we can actually work backwards from what does a stakeholder need to make a decision, or what sort of information do they require? What capability do we have on our program that we can bring to bear, or what could we bring into our program? And then how do we help deliver that? So here you can see Argo data are used in weather forecasting, which helps with food security. They're used in ocean forecasts, which helps with marine security and safety. And they're used in climate projections, which helps support sea level, understanding sea level rise and sea level projections, which are relevant to our coastal populations. So we've gone from hoping that someone will use our data, that we've got it right and that it's relevant, to actually planning for that to try and ensure that we can make it happen. So the range of application of IMOS data is really vast. So not surprisingly, it's used in oceanographic modeling, it's used in weather forecasting, and in fact, speaking to the chief scientist at the Bureau of Meteorology, he said that point per observation of fixed and floating ocean buoys are some of the most influential data they use in long-range weather forecasting. So this data is really critical in a range of ways. Climate predictions, supporting the blue economy and helping to de-risk our communities and our industries, and also improving well-being. I put this on here because we've been deploying some spotter wave buoys near the coast, and every time we put one of these in the water and make the data live, it gets absolutely hammered by surfers wanting to know what the conditions are. So our data are not just used by government and industry, the public is using them as well. So let me just give you a few examples of how our data has been deployed and things that where we can see use by end users. The first of these is around event-based sampling, and I think this is a topic I don't have to tell anyone in this room about. We've heard a lot about marine heat waves this week. IMOS not only has a group that considers when we expect to have marine heat waves, but we have the capability to launch gliders into those heat wave events to better understand what the conditions are. As you've already heard from others this week, this information is really critical for aquaculture industries who might want to change their practices or harvest early. Marine resource managers want to know what the impacts and implications of marine heat waves are going to be on their properties that they're trying to manage. So when we look at what these gliders can deliver to us, it goes beyond what we can get from the sea surface temperature. So here's a track from a marine heat wave where we can start to see the depth of the warm water penetration and the extent of the warm water. This is really valuable in understanding what the potential flow-on implications will be, and gives us a better understanding of what's happening than we would get from just the sea surface temperature. Another example is IMOS's animal tracking program. This is a really extensive national scale program that IMOS provides a backbone for. So what I've got here on the map is a range of acoustic listening stations that are deployed around the country. Anything in blue is IMOS owned and operated, and the ones in orange are independent researchers or research groups who have deployed their own acoustic receivers in the area. IMOS then hosts a centralized database for everyone to share their data and actually make those connections to understand how far these animals are moving, how much they're moving, and how connected they are along our coast. To date, over the last 14 or so years, this program has tagged over individuals from over 150 different species, over 9,000 animals, primarily targeted at commercially and recreationally important fish and sharks, but all the way through to crocodiles, turtles, and even dugongs. So it's a really extensive program that, like I said, helps us understand where animals go, where they're spending their time, which is really useful for people trying to manage those populations, particularly threatened species. But it's also really useful for fisheries management. And one of the things we did, probably published about a year ago now, I think, was did a network analysis to try and understand how connected animals were in the program. And having this continental scale tracking let us actually look at stock structure and what the population structure looked like. So here on the top is a plot of dusky sharks. You can see that we've got two distinct populations, one in the west and south and one in the east. We knew this from conventional tagging, but it's nice to have the data from this program to actually reaffirm that and reassure what we thought we knew from the conventional tagging. In the middle is a map of connectivity of bull sharks along the east coast of Australia. This was a surprise. We've got animals moving all the way from southern New South Wales up to the central Great Barrier Reef, repeatedly moving back and forth. This was unexpected and unknown and has management implications because these populations are managed very differently across the state jurisdictions. So something for managers to consider there. Yellowfin brim down there on the bottom left, again showing connectivity in that population to inform what those animals are doing. And then this one on the bottom right is probably one of my favorite examples. It's a fish called luderick, which was thought to be site attached to individual bays and estuaries along the coast. And the genetics couldn't resolve how connected or if any of those populations were connected. The movement data says that those fish are moving between these estuaries, and we have to rethink how we're managing those populations. Another aspect where ocean observations can be really relevant is in commercial shipping. Over 80% of the world's international trade is transported by sea. This is hundreds of millions of tons of fuel contributing to our CO2 emissions, and the International Maritime Organization estimates CO2 emissions from international shipping could increase as much as 250% by 2050. So this is a place where we can make a difference. And what you can see here in the top right panel is a path from a vessel that would be going from Europe to the US. The blue line on the bottom there is the normal route that the vessel would take if it was just planning point to point and taking the shortest distance. The purple line, which goes actually much farther, is the optimized route, and it's a route that uses the ocean currents to direct where the vessel should go. If they take the purple track, the vessel will still arrive in the port at the same time because it's not pushing against the currents as it's making this journey. They'll save up to 84 tons of fuel, valued at over 45 or 50,000 US dollars, and reducing CO2 emissions by 261 tons. So understanding what's happening in the ocean can be very useful and informative for people making these kinds of decisions in our industries that are operating in these areas. The next thing I want to talk about is layering benefits, and this is a project we've been doing with the Navy, and one of the things we're trying to achieve is getting as much as we can out of one piece of work. So the Navy came to us, this is an image from Northern Australia, and the Navy has we have really poor data from that region. It's quite shallow, Argo doesn't operate there, so the Navy was struggling with data for their models to operate in the region. We developed a program with them working with the traditional owners from the Tiwi Islands to put animal-borne sensors on olive ridley turtles in this area. And so we've been doing this for probably almost a year now, working on this program to create multiple layers of benefit. So by tracking these turtles, the Navy got important environmental data that they needed for the region. Threatened species managers got data for this critically endangered turtle and where it was going. We also managed to work with the traditional owner communities, so we trained the sea rangers on how to capture and handle the turtles, how to fit them with transmitters, and then also gave them the information back to their communities. These turtles are a totem species for this community, so they wanted to know where their turtles were going. And even more than that, they've used this data to substantiate how important the waters are around the Tiwi Islands and that they're valuable and need to be protected. We also have some challenges and opportunities going forward. Many nations are coastal. Australia is a very coastal nation, and we're having some significant issues now with coastal erosion. To understand how climate is going to change our coasts and continue to change our coasts, we need more information. And this is a place where we can actually really connect in with a wide range of end users. You can see in this bubble here a range of the people who need the information about what's happening with our coastlines to make decisions. That ranges from the weather service through to government, emergency services, insurance and reinsurance companies, our indigenous communities, and just the general public, people who want to use the beach and have houses near the beach want to know what's going to happen. So there are some real challenges in working in this space, but some real opportunities to use ocean observations to get into decision making and decision policies. The last thing in this vein is thinking about how we transform data into information. Most managers or decision makers are not scientific experts. They don't have time to deal with the data. They may not know what to do with the data. So translating the data into information that they can use is a really important piece in this process. This can also help with data integration and bringing physical and biological data together, which will help a range of non-experts, not just policy and decision makers. And hopefully, by doing this, we can start to increase the inclusion in our program with First Nations people or others who are interested in ocean information. So we do reasonably well in this area, but we need to do more. The rate of change that's happening in our oceans is driving a need for us to push the data to information much more rapidly. Now, one of the things we need to do, we're a government program, we need to be able to justify what we're doing and explain that we are hitting our targets and meeting these goals. So a big chunk of what IMOS has been pushing over the last few years is how do we track and understand this use? How can I assure you that people are using the data rather than me just standing here making the claim? So we've put a lot of time and energy into tracking the outputs of the program. And I talked to you about the areas of societal benefit that we work towards. We actually map the publications that use IMOS data against those different areas. And so we can use this to understand where our data is going, but also for me to understand where we have opportunities. So for example, here, energy security is the area where we have the least uptake. So it's a growth opportunity for us and a community that we probably need to engage with more. We also use this data to create case studies to explain what's happening in the program for people who need fact sheets. We can look at the variety of outputs that come from the program, so things from like publications, the number of postgrad students using our program and our data, products, projects, apps that are being developed. We can look at the different types of people who are using our data, whether they're domestic or international, are they academic, are they government researchers. And then we track things through to use in documents. So for example, the IPCC report that came out last year included 64 publications that used IMOS data, and they were cited 90 times in that report. Similarly, the Australian State of the Environment report came out this year, including 99 publications cited over 170 times. So this is a place where we can see that, yes, the information that's generated from our program is getting to the places we think it needs to be to influence how people are thinking about things and the decisions they may make. I'm conscious that I'm probably talking to a potentially academic crowd here, so we do also look at how universities are using our data. And in 2021, all of the research-intensive universities and the top 20 Australian universities published using IMOS data. That's 31 out of 42 universities in Australia, about 74%. If we take out the universities that were probably never going to use our data anyway, like some of the business-oriented universities, that number changes to 84%. If we look over the lifetime of the program, so 16 years now, 36 universities have published using IMOS data, which, again, if we remove those people who probably aren't going to use our data, that's 98% of Australia's university sector is relying on data from IMOS. We're also tracking government use, and I don't need you to read this plot on the right-hand side. Suffice it to say that it's a map of Australian government departments and agencies, and anything you see in dark blue are people who are direct users of IMOS data. Anything in light blue are people who are informed by IMOS data. Orange shows people who are partners or co-investors in our program. The tan are people we have organizational relationships with, and the gray are strategic areas where we intersect with government. So you can see there's a vast linkage here, and this is what I spend a lot of my time doing, going to government and reminding them that we have this program and showing them that we're relevant to the activities that occur in their portfolio. We can also track uptake into policy-related documents and reports, both nationally and internationally. We can do something very similar for industry use. So again, different sectors of industry, from offshore renewables through to oil and gas, fisheries, etc. And a couple of more specific examples of our intersection with industry. IMOS data were used for one of our major commercial fishing operators to get MSC certification for their toothfish fishery. This for them resulted in a 5 to 10% uplift in the price of their product. So this was a really nice intersection between the observing community and an industry partner. We also know that offshore oil and gas uses our data reliably to inform their floating production storage, offloading, their decisions about when and where they're going to do some of those activities and what timing they might rely on for those. So we can improve industry operations and maintain our blue economy, help them create jobs, and support their future decisions about how they're going to operate. Now, the last pieces I want to leave you with is, again, in trying to ensure that this isn't a just take my word for it sort of scenario, we got an economics firm to come in and do a return on investment analysis of our program. And they found a range of places where ocean observing, or IMOS's ocean observing, has relevance to our community. Everything from weather forecasting, so making the forecasts more reliable and more accurate, improving policy responses to environmental challenges, including climate change, helping understand natural disasters through better understanding of water temperature, which can inform the path and intensity of tropical storm systems. As I've just said, talking to management around commercial fisheries and helping inform that in a range of ways to increase their operations and the value of their products. Working with oil and gas and the maritime industries to inform their operations and the safety and security of what they're doing. And then we also work very closely with the Royal Australian Navy and Defence to help them collect what they would call environmental intelligence to inform their models and their operations and things that they're going to be doing in the region. So the conclusion from the return on investment was that the benefit to cost ratio for IMOS was up to 12 to 1. It ranged from 7 to 12, which they conceded was an underestimate, with approximately almost $5 worth of benefit for every dollar that's invested in our program. And these are the kinds of numbers that I think are really useful, not just for us justifying our existence, but for other programs internationally for justifying why we need ocean observing in our communities. But the report came with one really big caveat, and I'm going to read it out to you because as a marine scientist, this really resonated with me, and I was really happy that the economists captured it, given their different lens that they approach things with. But they said, to a significant extent, some benefits from IMOS's activities and data cannot be quantified. Knowledge of the ocean is a public good, the immediate value of which to humanity is not always obvious or possible to quantify in dollar terms. And I will leave you with that thought and say thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Impressive program. We have time for questions, and I will run and give the microphone.
Thank you. First of all, extremely impressive. But I was wondering, this seems a very big undertaking, not only in maintenance, but I think in manpower, in keeping all the sensors afloat, and maintenance, calibration. How did you manage?
We have a lot of partners. So I represent the office that administers the program. We have, like I said, we have the 11 major partners. So from CSIRO to the Australian Institute of Marine Science, several of the major universities, they do all the operating. We have over 100 people that are employed, fully or partially, in this program to actually do the operating and make sure that the equipment gets in and out of the water. The data center is a team of 30 people that are dedicated to getting the data in, making sure it's QA, QC'd and out and available to the public. So yes, it is a very big program, and we could not do it without our partners. I mean, they are the program.
Yeah, I'll just echo very impressive and amazing talk, so thank you for that. I'm curious if you could talk more about what I see as really low-hanging fruit, but huge returns in the transportation routes. And I think you said something like 84 tons of fuel saved and all this money, but how has this information been received by industry, or how do those networks get created, and just like how successful is that in changing behavior? Yeah, thanks.
So I am certainly not the expert in that. We have the graphic that I showed you. That's a slide from a small company that operates out of Hobart, and they provide that advice. So they take our data in, they bring in data from NOAA and you know the satellite systems and all sorts of different feeds, and bring them together and provide that as a service for industry. In fact, they inform a bunch of the racing yachts on which paths might be more optimal to them when they're running their races. So this is something that spins off of the data that we collect, and small businesses are using it. I know there are some industry operators that are starting to employ it as well, but that's probably about as much as I could say about it.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm working, it's not kind of question, it's just, I'd like to say a thank you to you guys. I'm working on World Ocean database, and every glider pieces of data comes through me to World Ocean database. So I'd like to thank Benedict, who is working at the University of Tasmania. So if you could please pass him my thanks.
Yes.
And keep doing great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So my question is that, as you probably know, and as we've heard from the reactions, IMOS is amongst the 3 best developed regional alliances of goose on the planet by far, and there is a huge gap between those 3 and the rest of goose regional alliances. Arguably, it might be the most advanced regional alliance. So is there any general advice you could give to people elsewhere where we work with goose to try to improve their operations so they can one day dream of becoming somewhere in your ballpark?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in one way we're very lucky because we're a single nation, and a lot of the other regional alliances are multiple countries who have their own priorities and their own funding, and that makes it really hard. But someone asked me last week, why is IMOS so successful? It's so successful because we started as a consortium of the major marine institutions in the country, and we all got together and decided we're going to work as a collective to deliver this rather than competing and running in different directions. And I think that's where we need to start with these things. If we can get people in a room and come to some agreement on these are the big priorities, these are the things we're going to work toward as a group, even if we start off with, IMOS didn't start off with 60 sub-facilities, we started off with, I think, 10 or 11, and the program has just grown and grown and grown as it's gotten momentum. So I think it's that cohesion and that cooperation that's really the kernel of it, and then things can get their own momentum and grow from there, and it will draw people to you once they start seeing that you're working together and you're successful.
Thank you very, very much, Michelle. So, from asking questions to get ready to answer questions, but first of all, presenting on the surface ocean CO2 monitoring strategy, Maciej, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Michelle, for this background. What we've seen in the last half an hour was the top-notch example of how operational system can work and deliver, and that's not everywhere like that. And we are going to focus for the next 10-15 minutes on the carbon globally, specifically carbon dioxide at the surface ocean. My name is Maciej Telszewski, and I try to coordinate the International Ocean Carbon Coordination Project, which we also double as Goose Biogeochemistry Panel, and therefore we are well aware of how well ICOS operates. So I would like to start with telling you what are the drivers, and you've seen in the last half an hour what operational means, and in the ocean carbon observations we are far away from that, and we need to start getting there because we know that the past variability of carbon flux has been large. We have no idea how the ocean will behave when we reach net zero, for example. And that's one of our ambitions, and obviously what's not monitored cannot be really managed. There are big implications in size, cost, and timing of the mitigation and adaptation measures that need to be put in place. And we are at the place where urgent decisions need to start to be being made. As you probably are aware, there is a lot of requirements put on the ocean carbon observing community by the highest level agendas, by UNFCCCs, by COPs, the Paris agreements, etc., the 1.5 degrees caps, and all that means that we really need to deliver very precise and accurate and well-covered information about the ocean carbon. However, all of that observing system is research-based. Is very much on a voluntary basis focused, and very little of that is at the level of coordination and operationalization, as we have seen is the case in some places like around Australia. So I guess you've seen this slide many times, and specifically this week too. The numbers change a little every year, but the main message, my main message from this slide is such that about 50% of what we emit stays in the atmosphere, about 50 goes somewhere. And this somewhere, half of it is ocean. And the effect of that is two-sided. On one side, we obviously know that thanks to that, less stays in the atmosphere, but it also impacts what happens in the ocean. And what happens in the ocean indirectly impacts again how much will be taken up by the ocean. And again, we are not monitoring that operationally at all. And what I'm going to spend another few minutes on telling you is how we try to move from research-based paradigm to the more operational aspect of observations. The same slide is just showing you how variable the sinks are. Above the horizontal lines, emissions, below there are sinks, and you can see that in all land, atmosphere, and the ocean, the variability is huge, and we can also obviously see that the increase in emissions equals increase in sink, but most of that, unfortunately, in the case of the ocean, is model-based. Only in the last 15 years we've been able to observe enough to be able to provide not even data-based, but data product-based estimates of what's happening in the ocean carbon. And that's, you know, in 2020, when we are asked to deliver monthly estimates of carbon flux on a regional, local scale in Europe, Australia, you know, Norway, so to speak, we don't have that capacity yet. And where we are, just one example, on the left-hand side is a plot from a paper from a few years back. The black line indicates what should be the Southern Ocean sink if we only took the atmospheric increase. The bunch of colorful lines show what a variety of data-based methods think this sink is. So you can see it's a mess, right? They do not agree very well, and that's because there's much more to the ocean carbon cycle than just the pressure from the atmospheric carbon dioxide. And on the right-hand side, there is a bunch of phenomena that happened there that influence the cycle and that influence the flux. And those phenomena are the reason why we even have the observing system for carbon. Basically speaking, people were curious how these processes work and started setting up observing systems. However, none of that was meant to become an operational, non-research-based activity. And we think that now is the time that we need to decouple a little between monitoring and research. Research still needs to be done and will be done, and we still have many unanswered questions. But a lot of the observations for ocean carbon need to become monitoring, operational based, so scientists don't have to spend time fighting for proposal money just to do the monitoring. The monitoring needs to be done for them. Right, so we've been working with a bunch of partners, and there were some logos on this slide that disappeared on me. And these are US NOAA and WMO and JPI Oceans and G7 and others, ICOS here in Europe too, to develop this value chain. We call it a value chain for ocean carbon observations. At the bottom we have all the observations that are actually being made, most of it in a research, on a research basis. Then we do work for the last 15 years on developing the data quality synthesis products. Again, this is not like in ICOS. We don't have 30 people working. We have like 5, and they're not actually employed to do that. They're employed to do other things. And, you know, quarter of their time they spend on that because we scientists believe it's very important. And our policymakers and managers tell us this is hugely important. Yes, you need to deliver. Then we do the interpolation, and that's needed because, as you will see in a moment, there are huge 98% of the ocean is not covered by our observations. And then we deliver, as Michelle indicated earlier, to assessments and synthesis and reporting that hopefully is being picked up by those who make decisions, and this feeds back. So just a few words on the observing system. The basis is called SOCONET, the Surface Ocean Observing System. For CO2, it consists mostly of the vessels, commercial and research, as well as moorings. And we measure mostly in the ocean, but also in the atmosphere. And it's worth mentioning because we do not have that many CO2 observations over the oceans, and this is 70% of our planet, right? Atmosphere is pretty homogeneous, but there are changes over the oceans too. But if you look at the map of what we covered in any given time, that's ridiculous, right? I mean, these lines are very thick. These are huge oceans. And you'll see from the data in one other slide that this is not a great coverage. And it's changing every year, every 2 years, basically, because the industry is not made to collaborate with us. They do that on a voluntary basis. However, if they change ships, we get out with our instruments and there is no line in the North Atlantic for a couple of years. Can you imagine? We do talk about 1.5 cap on the temperature and we don't have a single line in the North Atlantic for a couple of years. That's because it's not operational at all. It's research-based. The project finishes, the line goes out. So we also work with colleagues that are mostly focused on the time series observations, and we've developed CO2 systems for those moorings over the years. This is one example of them. But also when you look at the distribution of the major stations, they were put in place for other reasons. They are where they are, not because they wanted to observe carbon. And we have to live with that. However, we are not covering places where we should actually be knowing what's happening, where the carbon sinks, etc., etc. So one aspect, and I'm really happy that Michelle said that the success story behind IMOS to a large extent started with being together, because this is what we are in this community. It's just many more of that. And you know, we're joking in Europe that if two countries start to build a bridge, they probably miss each other because it's difficult to communicate and it's not language only. But at least we as a community are very, very happy to work together on all that. Now we need to persuade the governments, and there's more than one government, even though we have the European Union here and we have partners elsewhere, to do what we do. To the data, we've developed these data products, and we only focus on the top one here, which is SOCAT, Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas. Millions of data points over the years, quality controlled, and the bottom one is ocean interior. That's not the focus of today's morning. They share what's in red. They're community-led still. They volunteer. There's no direct funding for any of that. They're very fragile, therefore, and that's to do with money and people. And short-term funding is the main reason for that, but it's not the only reason. The fact that it's not in operational books of countries is the key aspect. And I know a little bit about IMOS, for example, and this is the country's focus. IMOS is one of the countries' focus to actually do what they do. And this is an example of what we are faced with as a community, and then we are asked to deliver. North Atlantic 2017, North Atlantic 2018, I mean, one line through the ocean. Obviously, in the coastal zones, the well-developed countries and regions, they do care about the exclusive economic zone measurements because this is the operational part. They really need this data, but we need the same here. And if we have that, what we do, we just interpolate, right? Happily interpolate. What else can we do? Better or worse? This is the Southern Ocean, one of the critical places on our ocean in terms of carbon cycle. 2000 to 2018, 18 years of data. Yeah, we have data here. So what we are very happy with is it's another network that was mentioned today and I guess throughout the week, which is Argo. And in March we had about 4,000 floats. You probably are familiar with this network. This is how the original Argo looks like, and what's important here is that originally it had one sensor here, temperature and salinity, and it worked very well, and the community was very happy and delivered amazing picture of our oceans. But wait, what happened when biogeochemists started playing with it. It's the Christmas tree of a float, right? I mean, you name it. It's on the side, on the top, big, small, hungry and not hungry for energy. This took years of development, but it also took years of persuading the core Argo community that we need to try and stick all these little toys on those floats. And now we are in the process of having this network of about 1,000 biogeochemical floats. However, it's only one carbon parameter at the moment that we are measuring. And this parameter, if you're into carbonate chemistry, is the least efficient one to calculate what we need to calculate, unless you are an ocean acidification fan like John here, and then you can actually do a lot. However, otherwise we need to still develop what we actually should be measuring on those Argo floats. Nevertheless, these 4,000 places measuring all the time would be a great step forward. Okay, we also use satellites, and that's just for showing you that this is an important part of our oceanography. The satellites change. How am I doing for time, Jon? Is it like 2 minutes, 40 seconds? Okay. All right. All right. So what we do with all this data is this is the data we collect. We interpolate using a variety of methods that compare pretty well by now. And then we take more satellite data to produce fluxes. And so this is very much model-based, even though we call it data product. This is the global carbon budget that I've shown at the beginning of the presentation. And the blue line here is what is data product showing us, and the black one is what models show us. So we see that they decouple, and the more data we actually have in the system, the more they decouple, meaning that we really need to start looking into data-based estimates. So what we're working on now is to move from the science-driven fragmented system through to individual components being coupled up all the way to near real-time delivery as we do in ICOS, but we want to do that in the whole global system for the carbon world. And this is how we want one day to be able to tell you that our observing system looks like. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Indeed, we're a little bit over time here. I would give one question if there is it's a typical, is there a quick question? No quick questions. Please also reach out to Maciej over the Hoover app. And as I said, reach out in the break, and we have a little bit of time at the very end of the session. So please approach Maciej. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
We're moving on, and I just realized that subtle hints don't work when you have a pre-recorded presentation. So, well, there you go. And I think we already see that through the presentations, we're building up a quite nice landscape or seascape of ocean observing through assessment to decision making. And I'm very happy to have Sarah now taking the next presentation. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much to everyone who has come out this morning after the conference dinner and on the last day of a conference that has been so full of amazing information and ideas. So I really appreciate you all coming. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. My name is Sarah Gaichas. I'm from NOAA Fisheries, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Woods Hole, and I have many talented co-authors here, and I'd like to also acknowledge the over 70 individuals and 14 institutions that contribute to our ecosystem reporting in the Northeast US. So what's our goal here? I think we've already heard that from the previous speakers very well. We want to bring the climate and ecosystem information into the management process, and the reason for doing that is to make better informed management decisions and really help people understand how to work through all of our industries and achieve our goals in the face of climate change and other ecosystem changes. So I think, and it's also been already reflected in the talks this morning, in order to do this, we really need to think about the types of decisions that are being made So in a fisheries context, that can be things like single species catch limits, but it's not limited to that. It's also allocations between fleets and areas. It's coordination across different management entities. It's multi-species and ecosystem level trade-offs. And so what I'd like to talk to you today about is how ecosystem information can support these many and varied decisions. And the key tools I'm going to talk about are ecosystem reporting, as well as risk assessment and management strategy evaluation. We've heard a lot about that in a whole session on management strategy evaluation yesterday. And I think a key point here is also to try to develop the decision processes that use this information along with the products, so that this is an evolving process, and a lot of these things do not currently have space in the management decisions right now. So working together with managers to make these products and processes is, I think, a good way forward, and I hope to convince you of that today. Because it's late in the meeting, I'm just going to give you my conclusions right now, and then if you need to go somewhere else or go get some coffee, that's completely okay, and I will not be at all offended. So overall, and this is speaking as a scientist working with managers, I realize not everyone is in this position, but overall as a scientist, I think it's very important to show up to management meetings and to show up regularly. So in science, our currency is papers, and we write papers, and we have written papers, and they're very, very important to write the papers, but please don't stop there with your science. Please bring it to the managers. Please come and talk to them and understand what their management objectives are. This is how we can get this information used. So we center our reporting on management objectives, and we focus on management implications, right? A lot of scientists, we talk about methods, we get really into the weeds. This is what we like to do. Managers need a different type of presentation. Listening to what they want and responding to their requests is very important. It sounds simple, but it's very, very important. And you're going to iterate this process. Do not expect to come in once and have it all work. We're going to do this repeatedly so that we keep getting closer to what we want to achieve, which is our goal of bringing the climate information into the management process. If you get the question, how can we use this? That's good, right? That means that people are interested in using it and they want to understand how to use it, but maybe they don't have a place in their process yet to use it. This is our opportunity to have these collaborations across disciplines, to work with the managers and the stakeholders to develop the processes. I'm going to suggest that you can bring in an example. It's not advocacy as a scientist to bring an example of how the information might be used in the decision process. But you should expect that example to change as you work with your managers and your stakeholders, and they tell you what they need. Again, we're going to listen and respond to those requests, and we're going to iterate. So I think this is a very simple approach. It's not rocket science here, but I do think that it has shown some results. It's an investment of time. It's an investment of money. Please make your papers open access. Managers do not have access to paid journals. And this, I think, shows some results, and I think it's worth the investment of time and money. So I hope to convince you with our regional example that I'm about to show. So. My context is the U.S. fishery management system. I think you've probably already seen a slide like this at some point in this conference, so I won't belabor it. But basically, we have federal legislation that lays out the general rules, but we have 8 regional fishery management councils that implement the rules. And because they're working with regionally different fisheries and regionally different stakeholders, their implementation can look quite different across the country. So the 2 councils we work with in the Northeast United States are the New England Council and the Mid-Atlantic Council. And so I'll be talking to you today about how we're working with both of those councils from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. Our State of the Ecosystem reporting, I'm a federal employee, so I have to use acronyms. The SOE is a thing that you're going to see a lot. I apologize for the acronym. But we are, again, these reports are intended to improve ecosystem information and synthesis of that information for fishery managers. So, like I said, we try to center these reports on management objectives, and these are derived from our federal legislation. In the paper by Garrett DePiper there explains how we came about with that. At the moment, these reports are contextual information. There is not a single individual decision that comes out of these reports, but they're meant to provide a broad context for decision making. We have been showing up to management meetings annually since 2016 to present these reports. I presented 2 weeks ago to the Mid-Atlantic Council. My colleague Sean Lucy presented 2 days ago to the New England Fishery Management Council. And these are really aimed at fishery managers. So they're not absolutely everything in the ecosystem, but they are tailored to fishery management relevant indicators. So The other thing I'd like to again emphasize is we are trying to do open science with this. So Kim Bastille, I love that you have 30 people in a data center. Kim is doing the work of 30 people right now to get our data together and really organize it and also make it available to scientists throughout the region. And I'm happy to see so many of our indicators showing up in reports at this meeting. And I'll spend the last part of the talk talking about how this is actually used within the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council's ecosystem process, where they are employing risk assessment, conceptual modeling, and management strategy evaluation. So briefly, we're trying to make this more than just a collection of indicators. We would like to have synthesis, and the synthesis themes that we communicate to managers are that there are multiple drivers of ecosystem change. So that's symbolized over on the left-hand side of your screen, and that regime shifts and ecosystem reorganization are possible. So these are things that may be novel ideas in a management system that's been sort of looking at things species by species or year by year. But much of the research I've seen at this conference is the type of things that we're actually trying to bring to the managers here. The report structure is structured for busy people. Managers are very busy people. So we have a graphical summary. Pages 1 and 2 are trying to get at the content of the entire report, and we realize that most people are only going to read these pages. So it's very important to get the messages in those. We talk about the synthesis themes that I just showed you, and the rest of the report is divided into 2 sections: performance relative to management objectives, which you see in the table up here, and risks to meeting those management objectives. So I'll briefly summarize that. But basically, these objectives have come from the national legislation. So they're things like providing maximum benefits to the nation in terms of seafood production, recreational opportunities. That's directly out of our definition of optimum yield. But there's also things about profit, stability, social and cultural objectives, protected species, and of course, the supporting and regulating services. So here's the graphical summary. You're not meant to be able to read this, but just to show you, we do try to show both what is the objective, what is the indicator, what is the trend and the current status, and what are the implications, importantly, trying to say not just it's going down, but why and what does that mean for you as managers. So that's the first section of the report. For this meeting, probably you're more interested in the second section of the report, the risks to meeting fishery management objectives. That QR code will take you to the report that was just presented to the Mid-Atlantic Council. As in many regions throughout the world, we're seeing warming and changing oceanography in our region, heat waves, instability in the Gulf Stream, all of the habitats that are being affected, distribution shifts, fish with poor condition, etc. And so this is a big message for managers, but I'd like to point out that when, as scientists, we see all of these indicators of climate all going in one direction, it's sort of shock and awe for a scientist, you know, oh my gosh, everything is really changing. But for managers, yes, that's an important message, but more important is connecting it to the managed species. And so this is what we try to do in the report. We incorporate our climate vulnerability analysis that was done for species in the region, and we note that for the Mid-Atlantic Council managed species, the climate vulnerable species tend to be, they're less vulnerable, but there are many that are vulnerable to distribution shifts. And so these have different implications for management, and we do try to talk about what those are, and the implications vary by species, and the report goes into detail in that. And it's not just fish that are shifting, it's also our protected species, marine mammals, and that changes the interactions. These are all things that are important for managers to understand. And so we do try to put it in this context. So the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council is comprised of folks from these states here and manages a range of species in fishery management plans, from invertebrates through small pelagics through predatory species. They are keeping these management plans in place as they implement an ecosystem approach. But the important thing is they've taken an integrated ecosystem assessment approach and adapted it for what they would like to do. So again, this is a science framework, but the managers told us what they would really like to be able to do with it. And the first thing they'd like to do is prioritize. They can't handle everything, so risk assessment is a really nice approach for prioritizing what the issues might be in the ecosystem. The second thing that they want to do once they've prioritized is figure out what is the key question, right? So a conceptual model is a really nice way to do that can be implemented pretty much anywhere, regardless of the type of information you have. Then once you've centered on the question, refined the question, you can go into more quantitative analysis like management strategy evaluation. For those who didn't see the excellent talks yesterday, it's basically a simulation analysis that lets you kind of crash test possible management alternatives before trying to implement them in real life. And so the key here is that there's a direct link between ecosystem reporting in our ecosystem and the risk assessment. The conceptual model is actually linking across those risk elements in the risk assessment for different fisheries or species, and the management strategy evaluation, therefore, based on the scoping done in the conceptual model, is including the key ecosystem and climate relevant risks. So here's an example of how that works. I'm showing our commercial revenue indicator that's in the reports, which is a proxy for profits, not a good one, but what we have right now. And so what's happened is the council, so we provide the indicators, and the council has defined what the risks are based on the indicators. At the moment, it's based on trend. So you can see risk levels from low through high, defined based on what that indicator looks like. And what we see is a significant long-term revenue decrease, and so that ranks as a moderate to high risk for the commercial revenue risk element. We try to tie that in with some of the other indicators in the report in the spirit of multiple drivers. And so what we see is actually a lot of the change in this revenue is driven by benthic organisms, specifically the clams that are harvested in the region. And those animals are very sensitive to climate change impacts, including warming and ocean acidification. We also note that the pH in the habitat for some of these species is approaching, but not quite at the threshold where growth is affected. So we try to tie all of these things together for our managers with both the risk assessment and the ecosystem reporting. What they wind up with is a matrix that looks like this. So we actually do a lot of different indicators across a lot of different risk elements as specified by the council to give them what one council member calls one-stop shopping in terms of what the risks are. We update this every year based on the updated ecosystem reporting. And so they get to see each year a summary of not just species level risks, but also species and sector level risks that have more to do with management. These have more to do with ecology and assessment, and also ecosystem level risk elements like the revenue. How are they using that? Okay, so they have gone to the second step. They've done conceptual modeling. And what you see here is the conceptual model for summer flounder, which was considered a high-risk fishery. And it is tying together a whole lot of those risks for summer flounder. I'm emphasizing discards here because the council decided that they wanted to evaluate recreational fishery discards using information in the ecosystem approach. Now, recreational discards doesn't sound very ecosystem-y, but the reason that they did this within the EIFM process was to see what other information could actually be brought into a normal management decision. And I think what they found was you can look at discards, but in order to look at discards, it's also important to look at distributional shifts, which have been driven by climate in this region. And so we just finished the management strategy evaluation, and I apologize for this very rough plot, but there's two things to take away from this. One, there's more objectives than how much biomass is in the system and how much fishing mortality is actually occurring in the system, especially in recreational fisheries, that people might want to keep one fish. They might want to, how many did they keep for trip? How many did they have to release? How big was it? Etc. And so we're able to address all of these things within management strategy evaluation, not just the normal fisheries management objectives. In green in each of these plots is status quo. And so all of the management objectives, you don't really need to know what they are almost always doing better than status quo. So we can do better than what we're doing right now, we found out from this analysis. And the other thing to notice, I'll just show you, keep one up here. The top plot shows the increase in benefit from each management type. But this bottom line shows what happens under a distribution shift. So even though we can do better, distribution shifts are actually decreasing our expectations in this ecosystem. So to wrap up, I think there's a lot of entry points for ecosystem information in the fishery management system and in many other management decision-making processes. And I think the key thing to do is to align the management decisions that are currently happening with the methods and tools that we have. And I think these are applicable across many, many places. So I have a list of the current decisions and the future decisions and some of the tools that can go with them. Keeping your data available is very important, as we've seen. And I just want to thank you very much. And I've gone over, so
Sorry?
I've gone over, so I can.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. And indeed, and there's more to be said than can be said in 15
Yes.
minutes, apparently. So thank you very much. Reach out to Sarah, both on the Hoover app, but grab her in the coffee break. And we are going to our next next talk, Dylan. And I think I just give the floor to you. Please, take it away.
It's on? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so thanks for coming. And, you know, during this conference, I got a bit inspired to maybe be a bit more bold, kind of go out on a ledge here a little bit more. So I kind of shook things up a couple days ago. And I think perhaps a better title for my talk now is, What Will We Leave Our Future? So we're all here for the effects of climate change on the world's oceans, and often we're projecting out into the future. A number we see a lot is 2100, right? And so I want us all to reflect on where we will be in 2100. If you're like me, we're not young enough to be here in 2100, right? So where will humanity be in 2100? Probably there will be some people like us in a room similar to this, somewhere else, asking related questions. What these questions will be, where humanity will be, is totally unknown. But we can leave them the keys for future success. And so on Monday, we saw some amazing photographs from Christian Clowers. This isn't one of them, this is just Google. It's a lot easier. But we have a global seed vault on Svalbard, right? And so this is forward thinking, it's a forward way of thinking about our future. And the hallways are filled with gifts for future humans, right? Should they need these gifts. And the hall of gifts I'm going to talk about today look more like this. So these are servers for data storage and maintenance. And these servers hold one of the keys to our future, right? This is better than gold to future scientists and researchers. So in many ways, we're already familiar with the power of big data. We've seen talks about global analyses throughout the week. And these would not be possible without access to huge amounts of data from many, many different people, very collaborative efforts. So we're familiar with open data and sharing data, but I think we can do a lot better. And so I'm going to give a bit of some examples from personal experience with ecosystem modeling. So end-to-end ecosystem modeling, you can incorporate everything from physics to fisheries, including ocean biogeochemistry, pollution, socioeconomic interactions, things like that. And these modeling frameworks are incredibly flexible in that you can include lots of different things, and they can become increasingly complex, right? But this complexity comes at a cost, and that is that these things are incredibly data hungry. Well, fortunately, we've collected data on many different things, right? From phytoplankton up through the trophic level to top predators like whales and seabirds, but also fishery fleets and different socioeconomic interactions. And these types of data exist on global repositories such as these, which are already really amazing resources, and their value is only going to continue to be increased as we meet our uncertain future. We also have more regional data portals like this one, which make local ecosystem-based efforts much more approachable and manageable. But almost certainly the ecosystem modeler and many modelers are going to rely on sources of literature to parameterize their models, right? And this, extracting data from this can range anywhere from having direct links to long-term repositories such as Zenodo or supplemental CSV files, all the way down to manually digitizing figures or seeing data available upon request quotations, which then you have to contact the author and it's a bit more work. And just so you know, in my opinion, sort of the holy grail is up near the top, where we have things in citable DOIs and long-term repositories. And I'm giving a thumbs down to this statement here. And why? I'm just going to return to the beginning. Where are you going to be in 2100 when somebody wants your data, right? Set that aside for a second. Where are you going to be in 20 years? Or 10, or 5, right? The average length of a tenure track research position is 20 years. And it's much shorter for postdocs and graduate students. So this is totally a false claim, right? It's a false promise. We can't rely on this for our future. And lastly, we all work as modelers with field biologists, right? We get a lot of our data from unpublished and published resources and collaborate a lot with field biologists. So it's inherently very collaborative to build big models, especially ecosystem models. And so I'm not going to dive too much into the details of my work. My poster was taken down yesterday, so sorry about that, but there's stuff online, and you can reach out to me. But just in brief, right, we use a lot of different sources of data, a lot of different local surveys, sources of literature, diet databases, and other publicly available fishing information. And so I can't overstate how collaborative these efforts are and how grateful I am for all of the collaborators and how willing they've been to share data with me. So what I'm about to say is no reflection on any individuals or institutions, but I'm trying to think of ways that we can all be a little bit more efficient together. So I went through and tried to quantify, how hard was it for me to get data sets, from collaborators and things like this, right? So I just counted the number of days it took from sending that initial email to finally receiving a sort of polished version of the data. And then I counted the number of emails sent by all parties. And so these are I should note that these are the major data sets. It's not entirely everything. And then these are the number of the hours of meetings, which, those always included different numbers of people. So the actual human hours here is, not listed. And so the point here is to just highlight that there are some inefficiencies. That wasn't intended to be funny, but you'll note that the top two took almost a year to get, right? The third one down the list had over a decade of data missing from what I finally got because it was in a different format. The metadata were sort of unsure. There'd been turnover in positions. And so there was over a decade of taxpayer-funded data that was just sort of, lost in the ether. These bottom two, in contrast, have lots of metadata published. They have their data available online immediately. And one of these even has an R package where you can write a couple of lines of code, download data immediately into R, and you're ready to go. And so I do want to caveat here that emails and hours of meetings aren't a bad thing, right? There's a lot in a data set, and there's a lot to clarify and a lot of caveats and things like that. So not inherently bad, but I think we can do a bit better. And so if we think our data collection efforts are important, beyond what we initially intended to collect these data for, and if we think ecosystem-based fisheries management is important, we need to make our data available. And this call for open science has come from the top down, at least in the US as well. So almost 10 years ago now, the White House released an executive order to make all federal research publicly available. And NOAA responded pretty quickly with our plan for increasing public access to research. And the good news is that our compliance with this has increased each year. The bad news is we're still a little behind other government agencies. And I think this might be more of a systemic issue, perhaps in our field, right? So this is speculation, but I just question that. And so why don't we share data? This is a survey of over 2,600 researchers in the biological sciences, so it's a bit broader than just fisheries and oceans. And one of the biggest reasons was that people were unsure about how to organize their data in a presentable and useful way, right? That's understandable. But what I'd say there is, the future is going to want something, right? And so if that's messy and disorganized, that's better than nothing, right? We can start somewhere. And I think this is probably related to a lack of time, right? It doesn't actually take that much time to upload data. It's more to organize it and present it and get orchestrated. And this is totally understandable. And we need to realize that field biologists can't do everything, right? At the institutional level, we need to start thinking about how do we allocate resources and actually put people, hours, and budgets towards organizing data and sort of preparing for the future. Some of these other ones are a little bit more straightforward even, so not knowing which repository to use, just pick one, right? There are many. I talked about some of them before, and the next slide will show some more. And the costs of sharing data, depending on your field, are relatively low, right? I'm not, an ocean system modeler, so, that's maybe a different story. And so there are many data repositories. I showed some earlier, as I mentioned, but these are some other ones that are very generic. So the Center for Open Science, OSF, and Zenodo are entirely free, up to a pretty big maximum. GitHub is not a long-term data repository, so you shouldn't use that as such, but it links directly with Zenodo, right? So it's very straightforward. Dryad has a small cost. Some journals cover it, but repositories are out there. And I just want to highlight that there are career advantages. There are incentives for this. So people have studied this in different fields, and there's anywhere from a 25% to 70% increase in citation rate if you link your paper to your data, just with one of these repositories. And you can take this a step further. You can actually publish data papers, right? So you can lay out all the caveats of your data set, you can describe your data set, publish this all in a data paper. Some of these, we all have careers and these things are important. Some of these have really high impact factors. And this allows a way to sort of shift the distribution in favor of some field biologists, right? A lot of field biologists don't get credit for their work because analysts are the ones publishing papers. And if we all have the same metrics for promotion and things like that, then we're not really creating a fair system. So this is one solution to kind of get around that. And we've actually seen a really great example of this just a couple of days ago. So people are using these data publications to sort of highlight data sets for broader use. And so with this said, I understand that there are a lot of other reasons people are hesitant or reluctant to share data and code. This is a paper that I led that we published last year, and so this is highlighting 12 reasons we think people don't want to share data and code, and just some counter arguments and some solutions are outlined there. So I encourage you to check that out. The smiley faces are actually the use of the Whova app poll, where you can ask people coming to your presentation. So I asked people, what are the barriers for you sharing your data and code? And I was able to put everybody into one of these boxes, which made me happy. It made me think we didn't miss a category, although we probably did. Just a quick plug for the Society for Open, Reliable, and Transparent Ecology and Evolution. That previous paper came out of a workshop at one of their conferences. They're all virtual, free to join, and they don't really care what field you're in. They're just here to help us adopt open science practices. So I encourage you to check that out. And so I'm going to end with these two doors because we're in Europe, and if you're from the States, you don't see doors like this. We have different paths we can take, right? We have a choice. And we can go about business as usual, and that might look something like this, where we have this sea of papers going into the ever expanding into the future, where we have to sort of sort through and look for data and find that those people don't exist anymore, and perhaps do some scraping of plots. Or we can prepare for a brighter future, where we can get organized, put all of our data online, make them openly accessible and available for long-term use. So the choice is ours. And with that, I have a lot of people to thank from the ecosystem modeling side, the open science side, some funders for getting me here to this conference, all the conference, the sponsors and the organizers, and the beautiful city of Bergen. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're running over time, but that's not your fault. Therefore, allow questions. Very far end. It's typical, and the question is always at the far end, isn't it?
Sorry for sitting in the back. Yeah, my question is sort of a comment. I think you sort of glossed over the cost question, but I think that is a major problem, especially for those of us who are in the ecosystem modeling world, where there's a lot of calls for making your data available, but there's not a lot of funding for making your data available. And the academic grant structure doesn't support long-term funding. You can get some money to put your data on a paid repository for a couple of years, but not long-term. I think this is a major, major gap in data sharing, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are varying levels here, and there's the individual level, there's institutional level, all sorts of levels, and we're all a part of these different groups, right? And so we all have a voice in trying to get more resources for these types of things, whether that's trying to convince funding agencies to help out, trying to convince our institutions to have some sort of centralized approach for doing this. And so I think it's very important, and I think these conversations are important to have. I will say that there are a lot more resources, I think, than we think are available. And so it depends on the size of the data, but a lot of these repositories take pretty big data sets, and I'm not talking about Earth system models because those are gigantic, right? So there's definitely an issue there, and I think it's just a conversation we have to have and start pushing funders and institutions in that direction, because we need support, right? If you want results, you have to support the work that we're doing, period.
Thank you. Is there any other immediate question? I don't see one. Please approach Dylan. I think, thank you very much, and I leave you into the break with some thoughts and reflections. So thank you very much, Dylan, and thanks for all the speakers. And we're reconvening at 11 o'clock. Take a coffee, tea, enjoy. Hello again. Hello again. Welcome to the next section of the session. Please take your seat. Still a lot of lively talks. So I'm very happy about how the session is going so far, and I think we will see a continuation of that. And I'm very happy to introduce the next invited speaker, who will be a pre-recorded presentation. It's Adam Martiny talking about something that we already saw on one of the slides, the BioGo ship, a global analysis of changes to ocean plankton systems.
Hi, my name is Adam Martiny. I'm from the University of California, Irvine. I'm very sorry I couldn't attend this meeting. It sounds like really interesting and fun. But today I would like to present some of the work that we've done as part of BioGo ship, which is the global analysis of changes to ocean plankton systems. Our best sustained synoptic global observations look like this today from satellites measuring chlorophyll. But how do we move beyond chlorophyll? How do we get measurements of all the biological diversity in the ocean, right, on a global scale, so that we can generate sort of similar figures like this for other parts of ocean biology? If we look into the OBIS system, we can see that we've collected lots of different ocean records of biodiversity in the last 100 years. However, they're often concentrated in regions of particular interest, like the North Atlantic Ocean. In contrast, if you go to the pelagic realm, and especially in the southern hemisphere, we can see that the data frequency is much, much lower, and many regions where we don't have any observations, at least not recorded in OBIS. And so we need better coverage and baselines to evaluate how biodiversity abundances, their range and distribution and connectivity within ecosystems are affected by ocean changes, like what is occurring rapidly right now. To address this challenge, we formed the BioGo ship team, and here you can see some of the different principal investigators that are part of this project, as well as the funding sources, including NOAA, NASA, and NSF, that are supporting this project. As I probably don't need to remind many people at this meeting, right, phytoplankton forms the basis of the oceanic food web and underpins the blue economy worth lots and lots of money. And so economically, they're very valuable, but they're also super valuable for the basic biogeochemical cycles of climatically important elements like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, etc. Elements that both play a important role in climate regulation, but also can be very important for ocean environmental issues like deoxygenation. However, the metabolic potential and activity of phytoplankton is recognized as really important knowledge gap for linking changes in the basic oceanic environment, like rising temperature or declining pH, and how those changes affects the functioning of phytoplankton, productivity, really requires a baseline understanding in the current ocean of the ecosystems, as well as starting to monitor how they are changing on a global scale, all of which we don't have. A parallel project is in its most recent iteration called BioGoShip. This is the extension of the World Ocean Circulation Experiment and in general, the repeat hydrography programs. The focus of this has been to detect changes in circulation as well as the uptake of heat and inorganic carbon. And to address these science challenges, you can see sort of a list of some of the primary observables as part of this program. But as you can see, there's no biology, despite that we know that biology plays a huge role in, for example, the distribution of carbon in the ocean, as well as the oxygen and nutrients, etc. So the vision of BioGoShip is to develop a deep understanding of the link between the physiochemical environment, as observed with regular GoShip, and the diversity of global ocean plankton and the biogeochemical roles in the context of a very rapidly changing ocean right now. BioGoShip is relying on, or is based on the idea that there's a series of mature technologies that we can now deploy shipboard-wise to collect very high resolution measurements in a very standardized and consistent way over long periods of time. So the first set of instruments are connected to the underway, the inline system on the boat. And this is to get a very high resolution understanding of changes to the surface ocean. The measurements includes optical measurements like backscattering, fluorescence, and absorption, but also flow cytometry and emitting flow cytometry. In addition, we have instruments mounted on the CTD to understand the vertical gradients from the surface ocean into the interior. Some of the similar measurements that we use for the inline system will also be, or is also attached to the CTD. Finally, there are some measurements for which we don't have sensors for at the moment. This includes a variety of different omics measurements like metagenomics and metatranscriptomics, as well as pigments and particulate organic matter. Finally, we're working with collaborators to develop and connect to bioacoustics so that we can connect the observations at the lower trophic levels to the distribution of biomass at higher trophic levels. These measurements will be used to address a series of science questions that are guiding our project. And one of the questions is, what are the global patterns of plankton taxonomic and functional diversity? But also the connectivity to the physiochemical environment will be of great interest, addressing the question, how do physical processes affect plankton community composition and diversity? We're also, as mentioned earlier, interested in the biogeochemical role of phytoplankton. And one of the key features is the variable elemental composition of plankton as they grow in the surface ocean and sink into the deep ocean. And that has been shown repeatedly to have an important effect on ocean biogeochemical cycles. We are, of course, also interested in the role of phytoplankton biodiversity on carbon export and carbon sequestration in the deep ocean. And finally, we want to address what is often considered the ecological master trait in marine ecology, namely the particle size, the plankton size spectrum. And to address these questions, we can integrate various components of these different measurements for cytometry, imaging, optics, omics, and the particular organic stocks. We envision the deep integration between regular ghost ship and bio-ghost ship. For example, the core ghost ship programmed through the very high quality detailed measurements of the ocean hydrography and the deep ocean elemental stocks will help us to constrain how differences in the ocean environments leads to variation in the biogeography and biodiversity of surface plankton. However, observations from bio-ghost ship can also be really important for understanding the variability in hydrography and the sequestration or depletion of various elements in the deep ocean. So linking the biology in the surface with the biogeochemical cycles in the deep ocean. There's also some aspects that may be not quite intuitive. For example, perhaps can we use slow-growing microbes in the deep ocean as novel traces for mixing? There's a lot of data and in a high dimensional space within the microbial communities in the deep ocean. So if we can use those as traces, that could be very powerful for constraining mixing. Finally, we can connect the differences in the biology with remote sensing products. For example, with the upcoming PACE satellite, we can use a lot of the bio-ghost ship measurements to validate these new measurements. About 2 years ago, NOAA, with the help from NASA as well as NSF, funded a pilot project to develop bio-ghost ship. Prior to this pilot project, we had been collecting various omics measurements at individual cruises, but never the full suite of measurements presented today. This pilot funding allowed us to greatly expand the measurement suite and on 3 different sections. One that's already finished to the Pacific Ocean, P2. One that is actually ongoing as we speak right now to the Central North Atlantic, namely section A16 North. And then the last section will be IO5 occurring this summer. We also have developing proposals to continue this so that we can start measuring all these biological variables on all the different ghost ship sections. And the hope is within the next decade that we have biological samples from all major ocean regions across the globe. Here's a picture from the research vessel Roger Revell. And as you can see, that we have the biological instrumentation definitely takes up a substantial footprint, but it's still possible to fit within a regular research vessel in combination with all the hydrographic and physical measurements done on a regular ghost ship cruise. However, we are also working on getting funding for a van, allowing us to put all these different instrumentations into one place to make it much easier to mobilize and demobilize, as well as standardize further the measurements. Now I would like to give you a few examples of some of the science that we can achieve with this type of data. In the first example, I want to address how we can use omics measurements to understand the global variation in types of nutrient limitation. In a series of studies, we have identified how phytoplankton populations vary in the genome content when they grow in either P, N, or Fe limited regions. Through gene gain and losses in phytoplankton populations, they adapt to differences in the nutrient supply of these different elements. So we can use these genomic changes as biomarkers for oceanic nutrient limitation, and that's what you're seeing on this figure. We can basically identify when the ocean are they limited by phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, or potentially co-limited by multiple elements. And as you can see, that there's a lot of variability in which element is limiting phytoplankton across the global ocean. However, there's also some very consistent regional patterns. For example, as previously shown, there's a lot of phosphorus stress in the North Atlantic Ocean, and the Eastern Equatorial Pacific is characterized by iron limitation. Furthermore, most of the places we see nitrogen limitation. But then there are also some surprises. For example, a lot of iron stress near the subtropical front and places in the Indian Ocean where phytoplankton appears to be phosphorus limited. So we can use these omics measurements to get a very high resolution picture of differences in nutrient limitation. Another example is we can estimate the bacterial biodiversity from the omics measurements. And that's what you're seeing in the upper left figure here. And how what we found was that when there's a lot of nutrient stress, there's really only a few lineages that are proliferating in the region, leading to very low biodiversity. And that really comes from the connection between nutrient stress and the proliferation of Plechococcus, and to a lesser extent, Paladibacter. Whereas if you go to high latitudes, especially past the subpolar front, then many more lineages are proliferating, leading to a much higher biodiversity. So there appears to be some rather consistent patterns in bacterial biodiversity that we can detect from these types of measurements. Another thing we can do is to connect the changes in biodiversity with some key ecosystem functions, for example, primary productivity. During the daytime, phytoplankton photosynthesizing, leading to an accumulation of carbon and an enlargement of the cell size, especially of the picophytoplankton. That leads to a diel cycle in the cell size, where they're getting larger and larger during the daytime and then smaller after they divide. And that leads to like a systematic oscillation in cell size, as you can see on these two images, both for Plechococcus here and Synechococcus. And the amplitude of this cycle in cell size indicates rather quantitatively how fast they're growing. If you combine that with the carbon cell quota, you can basically get the productivity of different lineages and how they contribute to the overall productivity of the community. So from that, we can derive rates of division, fitness, carbon uptake, and loss from these high resolution observations. One of the challenges with this project comes both as ensuring data standardization across all these cruises, as well as integration between different observation types. Standardization is a problem many people in ocean science are facing, but it's worth sort of highlighting that adding in omics measurements across many transects and many investigators leads to some novel challenges. For example, the technologies are really rapidly evolving. So even if you wanted to completely standardize the protocol, they quickly become obsolete, and new both sequencing platforms, DNA library preps, the way that the data is analyzed, etc., right, are all changing. The same thing is with imaging techniques. Furthermore, there's no agreed upon standard, so we don't actually know what is the right answer that we're trying to achieve. So what is the correct community composition that you're trying to get with these measurements? Or what is the actual phytoplankton carbon stock or their growth rate? Since these are very new technologies, it comes with a series of challenges in that regard. The other issue is integration, where data products from assessment are often derived from multiple inputs from different platforms, instruments. For example, no instrument can provide the full size spectrum of plankton, and you need to stitch together observations from multiple instruments. So to start to address this challenge, the PIs from BioGoShip, the broader GoShip community, our federal sponsors, as well as members of the various data repositories, all convened for this workshop. And the outcome was to establish a forum for dialogue and information exchange during the BioGoship pilot. And we've been very successful with that. And we shared information about what are the observations, and then start to discuss how do we manage all that very rich but also very diverse data. And we began mapping the data and the metadata flows to achieve that. Finally, we identified some of the possible data repositories and initiated discussions of standards and other submission considerations. We think these are really important problems that need really careful consideration in order to really understand how can we deposit high quality data and enable the rest of the community to use this data. We established a series of working groups due to the complexity of these variety of topics. For example, what are the data requirements for long-term storage? Where should we deposit them? Here there are lots of conflicts in the sense that different funders have requirements for data repositories, but then there's also this diversity of data may not fit existing depositories. Just as an example would be omics type measurements. And finally, we also created a working group to really start thinking about how do we integrate all these different measurements of biodiversity that all gives us sort of part of the overall picture. Another problem is with the standardization that was identified. And to start to address this, but by no means this will be the end. This is going to be a long journey. What we did was we used our favorite lab protocols in the different PIs for BioGoship and extracted the DNA and sequenced it with our own methods, and then started to compare whether or not we see the same differences in biodiversity between different regions versus the same, and to really understand how much does the different methods in preparing omics data matter for the description of biodiversity. This is still an ongoing project, but we just got the sequencing data back, and hopefully we can soon report how important, for example, DNA extraction methods and library preps are for the resultant profiles of biodiversity using various omics approaches. Another issue with data integration, right? A single data type has limited coverage and allows for quite limited inferences. Whereas if we really try to connect the different and integrate the different data types, it allows for much more rich descriptions of biodiversity or ecosystems. However, there are not really any agreed upon standards for how to do this data integration, and so we have to develop this. And to achieve that, we really want to connect to the rest of the biological oceanography community to come to well-defined standards. Just to give an example of one of these challenges, right? We can measure the biodiversity using omics, and here's an example from just a metagenomic library. But we can also measure the abundance of several of these lineages using flow cytometry. So how do we accurately integrate these two types of products in a way that where we get sort of joint variances and the proper description of that data? Another example is the plankton size distribution that we can where we need to collect observations from multiple platforms in order to get the full size spectrum. And here's just an example of how you can connect flow cytometry and imaging flow cytometry. And in the North Pacific here, you can see how there's vertical gradients in the plankton size using the combination of this. But how exactly these types of instrumentation and measurement are integrated is a quite difficult problem. And so we are working with a lot of different partners. For example, the Global Ocean Monitoring Observation System, the Integrated Ocean Observing System, and also some international partners in order to achieve this data integration, as well as help expand the geographical reach of bioecoship. So if we look forward, the hope is to develop global high-resolution optics, optical imaging, and elemental stock measurements, really observing ocean biology on a global scale so that we can get this baseline understanding as well as start to detect how climate change is affecting ocean biology on a global scale. Also, bioecoship, we hope to form a backbone for testing new biological and biogeochemical sensors. We're very aware of the powers of, for example, the Argo floats, right? And we would love to be to help adding new, more biologically rich sensors to, for example, to floats or gliders. Bioecoship data is freely available to the community. We hope that will provide a rich global set of biological data that you can all use. So in summary, ecosystem and biological measurements that we are collecting as part of bioecoship is essential ocean variables and are chronically undersampled in time and space. Mature technologies exist that we can use to scale up biological EOVs and make them consistent and routine across the globe. We hope that will form the backbone for supporting innovation, new sensors, so that we can get even higher spatial and temporal resolution. And finally, QA, QC, intercalibration, and consistent data policies are key for making the data fair, openly available, but also drive new innovations in model development, data science, etc. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and feel free to text me if you have any questions.
Thank you very, very much. I think you already realize how we managed the session in very subtly influencing all the people that submitted an abstract, how nicely that fits together. I encourage you again to write any question you have into the Hoover app or message Adam directly through the Hoover app and ask the questions. And as I said, I think when I'm saying things are coming nicely together, we have at the end of the session this 15 minutes, and I think I want to just like throw out maybe one of a question that you can think about, also through the other presentations. You know, we have seen, I think, through all these presentations that there are challenges along what is often referred to as the value chain, from ocean observing through data, through the analysis, to the actual products that are used in different contexts. So we see these challenges, but do we already know about enablers that helps overcome some of these challenges? Maybe you can think about that throughout the next presentations. It's my pleasure to invite Phoebe to the stage to give her presentation. So welcome, the floor is yours.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for sticking around for the last day. So I'm Phoebe. I'm an oceanographer at NOAA's Pacific Islands Fishery Science Center. And this morning, I'd like to tell you about some ocean and climate indicators that my NOAA colleagues and I developed in partnership with our Regional Fishery Management Council. So I'll give you a quick introduction to the council and what our stock assessment and fishery evaluation reports are. I'll go over some of the indicators, talk about how they're being used, and where we're hoping to go in the future. So this is work that we did in partnership with the Western and Central Pacific Regional Fishery Management Council, and they are responsible for fisheries management for the U.S. in the Western and Central Pacific, which is all of those yellow areas there on the map. And the indicators that I'm going to show you today were developed for the longline fisheries for our region, and these fisheries predominantly operate in this gray oval here on the high seas between Hawaii and the west coast of North America. These fisheries target swordfish and especially big-eye tuna, that's the predominant fishery, and they also catch a number of other large pelagic fish as well, such as other types of tuna, other billfish, mahi-mahi, and species like that. So each year, the Council puts together these annual stock assessment and fishery evaluation, or SAFE reports. And these are massive, multi-hundred-page documents that are full of tons of information about the fishery and the fishers. There's catch information, there's economic information, there's protected species information. They're huge. So in 2015, the Council decided to start incorporating ocean and climate indicators into this trove of data as well. And the goal for doing this was to try to bring in some climate awareness to the fishery management process. So we put together a suite of indicators that were designed to be fishery relevant. These are all indicators that we think are tied to fishery performance or the fish themselves in some way. And we're hoping to really build intuition about climate conditions over time and how they might be changing, and to put today's conditions in a historical context as well. And then another goal for these indicators over time is to allow for the recognition of patterns that we might be seeing, as well as relationships between the indicators, and hopefully to be able to develop some predictive relationships as well. So right now we have a suite of about 15 ocean and climate indicators, and I'm not going to go through all 15 of them this morning, don't worry. We group these indicators into 3 main groups. So the first group of indicators, we refer to these as our global indicators, and we use these indicators to set the climate scene each year. So these present information on anthropogenic climate change and the current state of some of those variables, as well as natural interannual climate variability. The next group of indicators are our fishery-independent indicators, and these are derived from satellite remotely sensed data, as well as reanalysis data. And these are all variables that are tied to the fish. They speak to the environment those fish are experiencing. They can contribute to distribution, abundance, size, and catchability of the fish. And then some of these variables are also used by the fishers themselves when they're making decisions about where and when to fish. And then our last batch of indicators are our fishery-dependent indicators, and these come from vessel logbook data, as well as dealer data from the Honolulu fish auction. And we know that a lot of things can affect these fishery-dependent variables, but we think that climate and ocean conditions are among those factors, and so we're trying to get a sense of how these are changing so we can connect them to climate conditions. So now I'll give you an example of 3 of the indicators so you can get a sense for the different ways that we present this information to the Council. So the first indicator that I'll show you is our subtropical frontal zone. This is the 18-degree SST isotherm, and we look at this averaged over the first 3 months of the year. So what you're looking at here is an animation of annual conditions with the long-term average is the dashed line there. And we look at this indicator because this 18-degree isotherm is the waters that are targeted by the swordfish fishery in the region. And this is a very seasonal fishery. They don't operate for the entire year, which is why we look at it just for the first quarter. So looking at this indicator can give us a sense of how far vessels have to travel to fish, which can affect the cost of fishing and the safety of fishing. And so we're trying to get a sense of how variable this location is from year to year, as well as whether its location is changing over time. Because you can imagine as sea surface temperatures increase, we would expect this front to be displaced northwards and farther away from vessels' home port. Together with the subtropical frontal zone, we also look at the transition zone chlorophyll front. This occurs in roughly the same location, and this again is averaged over the first quarter of the year. And this is the 0.2 milligrams per meter cubed chlorophyll isopleth. And again, you're looking at that animation, and here again, we're trying to get a sense of both the interannual variability as well as any trends over time. So the next indicator I'll show you is our estimated median phytoplankton size indicator. This is derived from a linear combination of satellite remotely sensed sea surface temperature and ocean color. And we actually present all of these fishery-independent indicators in the same way. So the first thing that we provide here is a map of the current conditions for the given year, and then in the contours, we show the anomaly from the long-term average for that variable. So for example, for median phytoplankton size, it looks like cells were a little smaller than average across much of the gyre, and then a little larger than average to the northeast and southeast of the gyre. We also present time series for these variables. So in the top panel, you're looking at a monthly time series of median phytoplankton size. We highlight the most recent year in a different color here at the end. We show an annual time series, that's that faint gray line that you see, and then the annual value for the given year. And then for any of the variables that have a significant linear trend over time, we include that on the figures as well, and that's that orange line cutting through the figure. We also show an anomaly time series, which is that same time series, but with the really strong seasonal signal removed. And so this just gives a sense of how things are changing when we remove that seasonal cycle. So here we see a decline in phytoplankton size over the time series. When we look at, for example, sea surface temperature, we see an increase in sea surface temperature over the time series. And then the last indicator that I'll show you is our big eye tuna catch rate forecast. This is derived from a statistical relationship between that estimated median phytoplankton cell size and then catch rates 4 years hence. And we provide this forecast for both the numbers of fish and the weight of fish, so the top and the bottom there. The dashed line is the forecast, and we include a 95% confidence interval about the forecast. But since confidence intervals can be kind of complicated to explain to non-scientists, and I would argue even scientists, we also include the actual catch rates for the years prior to the forecast, so that people that are using the product can kind of gauge for themselves how accurate this forecast is over time. So as you can see, it is clearly not a perfect forecast by any means, but it is the only forecast available to this fishery, and so we're really excited that we can include it among the indicators. So now I can show you some of the additional uses to these indicators beyond just in the SAFE report. So for example, that frontal zone indicator that I showed you grew out of an existing product called Turtle Watch that was developed by Heupel et al. In 2008. And that same 18-degree SST isotherm that the swordfish fishers are targeting is also the preferred thermal habitat for sea turtles. And when there are too many interactions between the fishers and the sea turtles, this fishery closes for the remainder of the calendar year. So Turtle Watch was devised to help give fishers some awareness of where the most high-risk waters were for interactions with turtles and a little bit of buffer on either side of that SST isotherm. So when we developed the subtropical front indicator, we were hoping that we were building off of a product that the community was already familiar with, and we were reinforcing that awareness and that environmental indicator that they were already using. Another use of the indicators that's been really exciting is the Marine Stewardship Council, when they were certifying the swordfish and tuna fisheries as sustainable, actually drew information from a number of our ocean and climate indicators when they were making that determination. So it's exciting to see that these indicators are gaining use beyond just the purpose of the SAFE reports. We're also really embracing open science with these indicators. The council has a data portal on their webpage. And so they provide background information on all of the indicators. There's some figures there. People can also download annual time series of each of these indicators, and they're working on adding the functionality to include those monthly variables as well. And then just this year, we've also put together a GitHub repository for all the code that goes into creating the indicators. And we are actively putting together the 2022 indicators right now. So we are continuing to build out this GitHub repository. So looking ahead, it's what's next. Each year we evaluate the utility of our existing indicators, and we also look at any potential additional indicators that we might be able to add to the suite. So for example, there's been a lot of interest in developing an indicator for eddy activity across the fishing grounds, because we know that eddies are really important features for these large pelagic fish that the fisheries are targeting. We've also had interest in expanding these indicators to other fisheries in the region. So for example, there is a troll fishery for yellowfin tuna that has expressed interest in having some indicators for that fishery. And we're also looking at additional applications of these indicators. For example, there are a small number of vessels that switch between the swordfish and the big eye tuna sector. This is a really expensive decision to make, and once vessels make that decision to switch sectors, they do not switch back for the rest of the year. So we're looking at whether there are any ocean or climate indicators that can help vessels make that decision from the best economic perspective. We've had a request to look into any ocean and climate connections to changes in bait availability for the fishery. So in recent years, fishers have been unable to get their preferred source of bait, and they've had to turn to alternative sources. And beyond just being not what they choose to fish with, there's also concerns about the sustainability of these alternative sources. And in turn, this can affect the sustainability of the fishery itself. So we're looking to see if there's any ocean and climate relationships between the availability of these different bait species in the areas where they're fished. We're also always looking for better ways to engage with managers and fishers and other stakeholders. And along with this is looking at other ways that we can provide this information. So a data portal and a GitHub site are really great if you're a scientist and you're data savvy, but we want to be able to provide platforms for folks to be able to work with the data and interact with it without having those data analysis skills. So one thing we're looking at moving towards is something like a Shiny platform where people can play with the data on their own. So I will close with actually a question for you all, and that is that I would love to hear any recommendations or tips that you have from similar efforts reaching out in your regions with stakeholders in your regions, or any lessons learned from things that you've done. And if we don't have time to catch up in the little bit of time that is left in our meeting today, I welcome you to reach out to me after the conference. I would still love to hear your thoughts. And I'm also happy to take any questions that you have this morning. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we do indeed have time for questions or feedback to her questions that she posed to you. So don't be shy. Sarah.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I'm really interested in you talking a little bit more about, it sounds like you have other fisheries approaching you to ask for indicators and how you kind of manage that process. Is that simply they read this report, or have there been other outreach activities? Thanks.
Yeah, so we present the indicators each year. We have a pelagic plan team that is an advisory body to the council, and we present the indicators in that plan team meeting. And so that's usually where requests like that come up, is through other members of the plan team or during the public comment period. And then also when the plan team recommendations are presented to the council, there's sometimes some feedback after that. So that's another avenue. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there more questions from the audience? Yes.
Also a question, not a recommendation. This is super impressive. I have nothing to suggest, but I wanted to ask about actually like the past couple years when it looks like the catch dipped substantially below the forecast. A lot has been kind of written and mentioned at this meeting about how forecasts are great until they're not accurate, and then sometimes, especially in the social dynamics of the industry, it's like worse than having nothing. Can you talk about what that experience has been like from the NOAA side in terms of how surprising that kind of move outside of the 95% confidence interval was, and if that's affecting anything about the future of the forecast?
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have a great sense of how much like the fishers themselves are actually using our forecast, which is a bit of a bummer. We're several steps removed from them. We do reevaluate it each year to make sure that it's still a meaningful relationship before we include it. So if we were to get to the point where that relationship would break down completely, we would then remove that from the indicator report and maybe just keep monitoring it going forward. Yeah.
Wonderful. Is there any urgent additional question? Otherwise, please don't hesitate to reach out to Phoebe and contact her either through the Hoover app or through email, or catch her during the break. Thanks a lot. Thanks again very much. And we're going to our next presenter, Erin. So just please come up to the stage. The stage is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Really appreciate this. This has been an amazing conference, so thank you. So I wanted to start off with this quote, which I think to me really resonated. I feel like we've heard this in the past, and we're hearing it again throughout this week, which is that reports of unusual happenings come from wide places. More people are in more strange places, writing letters, I'd like to add, or emails about more strange happenings. And so I just felt like this really still rings true 6 decades later. And so to me, the long-term ocean observations are really essential to understand this change. We've heard this, we'll hear it again, but to me it's foundational, like the foundation of a house. It's so important, but often unspoken in many cases. And so we really need these on the order of decades. And I wanted to show this because this shows that about 7%, give or take, of the global surface ocean is covered by biological ocean observations. And when we say long-term here, this is 5 years or more. But when you think about that kind of on the order of programs that have been operating for decades, this comes to a handful of programs. And so CalCoffee is one of the longest integrated marine ecosystem observing programs globally. And so for me, that's why I find it so exciting. And it measures over 20 essential ocean variables. And so CalCoffee is situated in the California current ecosystem, which we've heard many talks this week about. And it samples quarterly, so 4 in the yellow and another 2 in the white region, over about 500 kilometers offshore. So to me, I thought a historical perspective on this, given these quotes from kind of historical context, was important. And so kind of the origin story of CalCoffee is where I wanted to go next. So we're going way back. This is up until about the early 1800s. Sardine was not considered very valuable. It was basically like a trash fish. And so this is a quote from 1858. And then in 1916, attention quickly turned to sardines as a food source during food shortages during the First World War. And I wanted to mention, because I actually walked past this, that at this same time here in Bergen, there was one of the largest sardine factories, USF. And you can go see it if you have time this weekend. And then at its peak in the mid-1930s, the Pacific catch became one of the largest fisheries in the Western Hemisphere. And it was, you can see the annual landings in metric tons, and it was capping out over 700,000 metric tons. And so to give you a sense of what this actually looked like, John Steinbeck said, "Silver rivers of fish were pouring in and out of the boats, and the boats were rising higher and higher until they were empty." And so then with the Second World War, we see the same thing again. The demand continues to soar and capping out at large quantities of fish being caught. But then in the mid to late 1940s, it collapses. And so at that time, I said the acronym, but it was called the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigations, fondly known as CalCoffee, was born. And what I think is really neat is it actually was this unique partnership of federal, state, and academic agencies coming together. And the main goal really of the program was to understand, is this climate change, is it overfishing, or a combination of the two? And to answer this, the program really studied holistically the entire ecosystem. It was trying to understand the context of sardines, not just the physics, the chemistry, also the biology, and also the fishing effort. And so I've created this very simplified diagram as I go through my talk, so you can kind of see this is the framework and kind of the way we're thinking about this in this complex kind of social ecological system that we've been talking about. And so, spoiler alert, but ultimately it was a combination of these factors that influenced sardines. And so these decadal scale oscillations, as we know, are very well known in the California current and throughout the world. And so these oscillations coupled with fisheries interact to affect forage fish. And so, okay, we're picking back up in 1949, now when CalCoffee was started. And you can actually see it's well known that the dynamics of anchovy and sardine fluctuate opposite to each other. And so you can see that around the late 1960s on, anchovies now came onto the scene after the sardines crashed. And then sardines were big again in the 1990s to about the 2024 or 2025, and then anchovies again. So kind of see this shift back and forth. And what I thought was really interesting is we see this same pattern with these shifts happening in the larval fish abundance. And so you can see this is the logged larval fish abundance related to year. And so kind of going from this anchovy, sardine, anchovy regime. And the dotted line is there because that was when CalCoffee actually changed their sampling to every 3 years. So I just wanted that to be shown here. And so a simple explanation for this was that this is, the PDO, we have the negative, more cool anchovy regime, and then the positive was the more kind of warm sardine, which is probably a narrative you've heard. And the concept of these regime shifts actually was first published in the Cal Coffee reports. And so it was basically that John Isaacs, the same person who said the quote at the beginning, asserted that there weren't really normal conditions, that basically these regime shifts are operating and they happen quickly and are unexpected. And so we shouldn't expect that, there's some level of normal. And so these shifts in the Cal Coffee data actually correspond to known published regime shifts. So this is in 1988 and 1989 regime shift. You can see the response. And then the 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave, which we've heard some amazing talks on, in 2014 to 2016. And so given that Cal Coffee had this kind of the visionary founders of this ecosystem concept, I don't have time to go into all of these, but you can see that both of these shifts correspond to many other shifts in the regime at that time. So just one example is seabirds in 1988 to 89. Basically, they changed their abundance at that time. And so that's known from the Cal Coffee seabird records, and I think Bill had chatted about those a bit. And so going back to this, what's interesting, though, is that there's these novel conditions happening kind of after 2014. And you can see this here, that anchovies are dramatically increasing at a time when the water is really, really warm. And we're trying to figure out why might that be? And so in the past, it was thought that they actually thrive in these cool regime, maybe not cold, but cool regime conditions. And what's interesting now, too, is we're seeing that these larval anchovies are actually co-occurring with what were traditionally thought of as southern mesopelagic fish. And so there's really this novel assemblage starting to come together in the California current. And so what I thought was really interesting is that both of these time periods have this known increased coupling happening between the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, PDO, and the NPGO. And so basically there's this non-stationary relationship happening between them, and so it creates these different conditions where we may end up seeing the ecological meanings of these indices that we traditionally thought were one way shifting. And so I think a key point of this is, what are the consequences of this? I mean, we have basically this idea, this paradigm, but now what happens when that breaks down? And kind of speaking to the forecast, I feel like the last question, it's like, what do we do? How do we deal with this? And so I think a key point is that it's really challenging to make predictions in some cases if you're switching between regimes and they're unexpected and unknown. And then these ecosystem approaches can really help to incorporate this more holistic way of thinking about it. And then finally, there then is this need to integrate this low frequency variability into management. And so I thought very fitting that actually Pacific sardines are one of the few operationalized examples of this where that low environmental variability has actually been included in fisheries management. And so basically, the sardines have been related to sea surface temperature to get the maximum sustainable yield. And at first, I believe prior to 2012, that was just 1 point along the California coast. It was taken from a pier. And now it's been revised to basically take the sea surface temperature across the entire spawning area of the Cal Coffee domain. So that kind of shows to me this adaptation also in management that's essential for this. And so I wanted to add that we're also using many novel techniques to get at this question and to try to understand some of the mechanisms, kind of not just these correlations, but why is it that we're seeing these novel conditions and these fluctuations. And so we've been looking at environmental DNA to help actually characterize the larval fish assemblages of the area and in a relation to the bacteria, the phytoplankton, and the zooplankton that are in the water. So kind of looking at what could be the potential ecological habitat, and then using stable isotope analysis to actually look at these trophic dynamics. And that is revealing that there's some shift there. And so, kind of in conclusion, I think forage fish are really key indicators because they serve as this middle link between kind of the social and then physical and ecological systems. And non-stationary dynamics are really increasingly important in this, kind of going from these different phases and regimes over time. And we really need those long-term observations to get at, I mean, you can see just a few regimes over time, even when you have some of the longest in situ time series. And then novel technologies can really help to understand the actual dynamics and mechanisms of this. And then the solutions really are going to require this long-term, robust ecosystem data that's so foundational to a lot of the models and other things that we're working on. And so where are we going? This, to me, is a call to all of you. I would love to chat more. I think for me, my main interests are really how do we connect long-term ocean observations, the physics, the chemistry, the biology, to the social and human institutions that are so connected. To also assess, are there these early warning signals? I know we've heard of some that we can see in order to actually predict and better understand these dynamics. And then getting at these actual mechanisms of change. And then disentangling this climate, as we've been talking about, climate change versus climate variability and what that actually looks like. And so, if you'd like, to me, the Cal Coffee is really a community. It's a very large, integrated community of people. And so, if you'd like to join us, we have many ways through either events or you can join the listserv. And also, please use the data. I was really excited to hear the open science talks, where that's been something we've been working a lot on, is how do we bring, Cal Coffee has so much data, it's not integrated, we're working on integrating it to get these more ecosystem level effects. And so I'd love if you want to use it for lessons or research or anything else. So with that, I would like to thank all of you and thank everybody that makes the Cal Coffee program what it is, and the founders as well as everyone throughout its history. And yeah, I'll take any questions and I'll leave you with this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erin. We do have time for questions. Yes, Evan.
Thanks, Erin. I was really struck by the gap in the time series. And I think one thing that is stationary is our budget situation. So
Great.
speaking to people that can be decision makers or financiers in some ways with these stationary budgets, what do you suggest we do in terms of prioritization to make sure that we're collecting what we need to when we even need to collect the ecosystem information even more? Do you have any ideas or suggestions for us on how we would do this so that we do continue to have the time series we need? What are you thinking about for Cal Coffee?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously always at the forefront of our mind. I mean, I think one thing that comes to mind related to the funding is, I think for us, we've been continuing to evolve the operations. So through, as I mentioned, some of these novel technologies, as well as gliders and kind of other ways to integrate and bring together these. To me, integration is a key piece. So funding integration, how do we bring that together? I think it's like funding the core operations as well as integration and then dissemination. And one of the things, kind of speaking to your point, that I was thinking about throughout the course of this session today is, I think across this data value chain or cycle, I think in some ways we need to keep partnering and funding each of those points along that entire cycle, because I see a lot of times we can fund the data collection, but if we're not able to actually get that to where it needs, the sustainability of that data collection becomes in jeopardy. And so to me, again, it's like, maybe I'm asking for fund the whole cycle, but I think if kind of partnerships across funders, I think could also, some of the, partnership programs that support that, I think would be extremely valuable and help to kind of bring that whole cycle together. So yeah, thanks for that question. It's very key.
Thank you very much. Are there more questions from the audience? I have the feeling I need to wake you up a little bit here. Yes.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I'm super interested in zooplankton as an indicator, and your slide about eDNA kind of, I guess, made me wonder what your current protocol is for processing zooplankton samples, and obviously speciating samples is incredibly time consuming, and if you have any sort of thoughts on where that field is going or directions, improvements, other novel technologies, just sort of where your thinking is around that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so around zooplankton, I would say, a great question, because that is where there's a lot of development still happening. I mean, I think the reference libraries are one of the largest points where we need to continue to build up, and so we've been doing that in the California Current, but I think there's a lot to be done in terms of actually having the resolution that we might need in order to, especially with zooplankton, I think, because it is more developing. I'll just mention it's slightly separate but related to zooplankton. In tandem with that, we're actually working on how to detect kind of more cryptic marine mammal species, potentially, with eDNA. So that's been kind of another avenue, looking at prey as an indicator through eDNA, as well as actually the detections of the marine mammals themselves. So yeah, I think I'd like to chat more about that. So thank you.
Wonderful. So
Great.
you should catch up during the break.
Thank you.
So thank you very much again, Erin.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think these were really, really good questions, and it goes back to what I said just after the break. Where are the main challenges throughout the value chain, and what are the enablers? And we heard a little bit about, the business case, what is the added benefit, and how can we make that actually as a driver, maybe, to also communicate the need for the different funding of the different parts of the value chain. So we are going and moving to another amazing example of an integrated ecosystem program, the Southern Benguela, a South African multidisciplinary flagship on ocean observation for assessing the marine environment. That's an online presentation, and we play the video by Keshnee Pillay.
Good afternoon. My name is Keshnee Pillay, and today I'm going to talk to you about a monitoring program that I run on the west coast of South Africa. Monitoring the environment is extremely important, and this is an audience that understands that concept. However, I'm just going to mention that in South Africa, at our highest legislation of the land, which is our constitution, the monitoring of the environment is mandated. Everybody has the right to an environment that is healthy and protected for themselves and their well-being and the well-being of future generations. The environment also has the right to be protected for itself. And so this gives us as government scientists the mandate to allow us to do the kind of work that we need to do to protect, conserve, and sustainably utilize the environment. So where is the west coast of South Africa, and where's the Southern Benguela? So this is the African continent, and down here at the bottom on the west side, we have a large marine ecosystem, which is known as the Benguela Large Marine Ecosystem, Benguela Current Large Marine Ecosystem. And this spans 3 different countries, South Africa, Namibia, and Angola. So the southern portion of it sits squarely in South Africa, and that is where this monitoring program is run. So the monitoring program started really in the 90s. However, I obviously only took over much later than that. And so when I took over in 2009, I wanted to grow it a little bit, standardize it a little bit, and figure it out. And so what I did was look into how much work we were doing on the West Coast over the span of decades, and how much work the South African government had done. And what I had found out was that we had been doing this plankton research since 1950. It had been ad hoc, it had been research-based, it was not standardized in time or space. But over the years, it became a little bit more and more standardized with the last diagram that you see here, where they had quadrats and it was standardized collections in there. But it still had a very fisheries-driven methodology. And it resulted eventually in the 90s in these 2 monitoring lines. The southernmost monitoring line, which is the Sardine Anchovy Recruitment Program, started in the mid-90s, and the one further above that is the St. Helena Bay monitoring line, which started in the year 2000. These two monitoring lines were monitored monthly since they started. However, the methodology on both the lines were not the same. So the data is not entirely comparable. So this is where I sat when I took over. And so the first thing that I wanted to do was to standardize collections, and that's what we did. So we standardized collection between the two existing lines, and that gave us comparable data. And from there, I looked at a desktop study of all of the data and information that was available for the west coast of South Africa. Information is a word I'm using loosely here, and data even to some extent, because this is what we had collected and not all of it was translated into data and information yet. Some of it was samples, everything was in different blocks. But what we had was oceanographic data that now goes back 100 years. We have wind data that goes back even further than that. And plankton, which is the core of the monitoring, went back to 1950. Your birds went back to 1923, and the whales went back quite a few decades. I don't have a number because at the time, of course, many decades ago, there was whaling and not everything was written down and submitted the way that it should be. But I do have data that goes back quite a number of years. So where I sat at this point was that we have all of this data and information, and I knew that we needed to do something with it, some kind of ecosystem indicators, but not entirely sure what it should be. So I'm going to skip ahead by 10 decades. 10 years. And this is where we sit now in 2023. We have this integrated ecosystem program in the Southern Benguela. I added 2 more monitoring lines, which is the Namaqua and the Plain Sea line, and now it spans the entire Southern Benguela. We're using these historic data sets and the archived samples, and we had 6 aims. So we wanted to create a coordinated observational platform, then create new projects to bridge the gaps. As I said to you, we only had 4 or 5 main things that we were doing, so we had a number of gaps. And then we wanted to innovate, where we applied new technology that was scientifically rigorous, but it was going to give us a quicker turnaround time. So it was less time consuming, but also more cost effective. And we decided to go with the United Nations Goose Essential Ocean Variables. And of course, we aim to build capacity in South Africa and train people and to use the platform for mutually beneficial partnerships. And all the data that we collect is then validated and distributed freely because we're a public entity on our data and information system, which I'll go through in a second. Okay, so the first outcome was this observational platform. And the platform is now doing regular seasonal monitoring. It is not ad hoc anymore. It's standardized monitoring stations. It's standardized methodology. That's methodology at sea, in the laboratory, and now data standards. Everything is standardized with collections. The data is now comparable. We have standardized operating procedures. We do have a much quicker turnaround time to information. It can be quicker, but it's much quicker than it once was. And having this suite of integrated variables gives us the opportunity to answer a lot more questions and different types of questions. It's not just the questions that we initially asked. There's a whole bunch of other things because we're collecting the same kind of variables everywhere that can be asked and can be answered. So all of this data is then available under our information management system. So for the existing data that was found, we had to ask the question of, is everything analyzed? Do we have data? Is it in a database? Have we analyzed for our trends, our patterns of change over time and space? And does it need to be reanalyzed to meet our current priorities? And our current priorities are ocean warming, acidification, pollution, water quality, trophic functioning, and eutrophication. And most of our data does need to be reanalyzed to meet the current priorities. So our monitoring program is currently being registered under the GeoNodes. That is where you'd find it. Our data does not sit there, but there would be a link to where you can find any data if you need to. So the second outcome is about bridging those gaps. And so all of the data that we found was then repackaged and put into something that made a little bit more sense. And so we ended up with these 15 projects. They all started at different times because we put them into play and into practice at different times so that we could manage it better. They all are now actively collecting data and information. So where we sat with the concept at where we are today, our third objective was to innovate. We were not trying to create new methodologies. What we were trying to do was to implement new methodologies that we had not implemented. And I can't go through every single methodology, so I'm just going to pick a few examples of what we're doing. So one of the examples is microplankton. And in this case, we had existing samples that were not analyzed. So there's no data, there's no information, and we need to analyze it in a way where we get a quick turnaround time. The traditional way of doing this is microscopes, but that's not going to give us a quick turnaround time. So what we decided to do was to use the flow cam. This still gave us a direct measurement because you can see the organism, but these are pictures. So it's less time consuming, it's more user friendly, but we do have a lower taxonomic resolution. This has been going on for a few years. And the information would be available on our website. The next example is mesozooplankton, and this is the core of the monitoring, is mesozooplankton. And it's always been used, we've always used microscopes to analyze it. So this was a different situation because we have existing data, it's just with gaps, but it required a faster turnaround time to information. The microscopes gave us detailed studies. However, it was time consuming and it was intensive in the training. So we moved to ZooScan, which was also an image analysis method. It gave us a lower taxonomic resolution, but it was 16 times faster. We did move away from using the 2 mol subsamples because we were, through our protocol testing, I noted that we were missing a lot of organisms or types of organisms by using a 2 mol. So now this allowed us to do better subsampling. We have machine learning that then allows us to do the analysis to taxa. We can, for some of the species, get down to genera, but you're not going to get down to species. We are now even moving away from ZooScan and we're moving to the FlowCam macro. This is also a direct image analysis method. It has the same lower taxonomic resolution than a microscope, but it has higher resolution images. It's even less time consuming. So there's no need for subsampling and there's machine learning support in with FlowCam. And in this case, this would be the first time in our 70-year data record that we would have the ability to analyze an entire sample. Microbes is something that is completely new to us, and it's something that we started. And so the technology that we used here was the flow cytometer, and we used DNA analysis. And I'm not going to go through the details of it, but it's what's showing you here is inshore and offshore differences that we found. The paper is there if you want to go through it. For this, because it was completely new, we partnered with universities and we had a postdoc and a PhD working on it, and it meets our training obligation as well. And what they do is they come in and they do all of this work, and then we will then continue the monitoring once the PhD is finished. One of the newer technologies as well is microplastic. This is one that we did innovate in the real sense of the word, because it's a methodology that we created for looking at microplastics within the zooplankton body, which isn't a methodology that's out yet. We have a paper out and we have a few more coming out. The methodology as a step-by-step is not out yet. That's because we have 2 PhDs working on it and we just have to wait for them to finish first. And so this is something that is extremely important and is, again, collected on every single station across the west coast of South Africa. So we're measuring EOVs, and we've decided to go with the United Nations Goose. So from the existing data that we had, so these are the multiple decades worth of data, we can get 11 Goose EOVs, and you can see them there. Well, actually 10. One of them is a new EOV. So the one that's in gray is the terms of reference would not be found on Goose. It's one that we're developing domestically in South Africa. And once the terms of reference is available, it will be available on our management system. And then from the new data types that was introduced post 2013, we have another 11 EOVs. So in total, we have 22 EOVs that we would be using to assess the environment, and that would also go out publicly and in to the global environments, and we do SDG monitoring and things like that. Okay, so our fifth outcome is capacity building, training, and partnerships, and it's purely mutually beneficial partnerships. We do have a lot of infrastructure, and what we have decided was that we're going to partner long-term partnerships with people where they get something and we get something. And so these are our long-term partners. We do training at sea every single cruise, so that's every single season. We train scientists and technicians, so we have two aspects of training, and then we have obviously interns and postgrad students. We do the same thing in laboratories. We do training there, and then we have ad hoc training. Okay, so the sixth outcome is our marine and information management system. So that's the website where you would find all of our data and information. It's freely accessible and available to anybody. You just download the data. So if you do a quick search inside there, you'd see the Integrated Ecosystem Program has 217 data sets. It's not as much as we should have, but this is a new system, and so we're populating it as we go along. But if you click on any one of them, there's a blurb that I've written, and it will tell you what data is available under the program. So if you do want something and you can't find it there, all you need to do is you click on the support and data access, and you open a ticket. It's a ticketing system. And the data curators, you just ask them for what you want, and they will get in touch with me, and we will try to figure it out. And then we have ad hoc outcomes that I can't really account for. It's just things that happen because we're out there. And one of them is that we have the first blue whale sighting in South Africa ever. We thought that they didn't occur in South Africa, but apparently that they do. As many of you know, these are protected species. And what we actually saw was a mother and calf pair. And the calf was so young that it had to have been born somewhere in the Benguela. And so everything had been validated that this was a mother and calf pair of a blue whale, and it's published there. So if you want to go read the paper. And so now we know that we do get blue whales in South Africa, in South African waters. So sorry for the quickness of this, but thank you. If you have any other comments or queries, please feel free to email me or message me on the app. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and don't hesitate to contact her through the Hoover app. And it's very encouraging to see actually that even though they have never been reported to see blue whales and actually a blue whale with a calf, I have to say that is quite positive. So to wrap up the session in a way, we have another invited speaker, that is Patricia Miloslavich, and she will talk building a global multidisciplinary observing system. Unfortunately, Patricia can also not be here with us, so we'll see the recording. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Patricia Miloslavich. I am the Executive Director of SCORE. I'm going to share my screen now and go ahead with my presentation. Okay, so thanks again for inviting me to this session 12 on improving pathways for delivery of multidisciplinary ocean observations into marine assessments across multiple scales. I am going to be presenting about building a global multidisciplinary observing system. So just to start, I want to tell you that the foundation for multidisciplinary observations was really the first expedition by Her Majesty's ship Challenger expedition, which was really the first global oceanographic expedition taking place for 4 years, more than 1,000 days, 68,000 nautical miles, sampling in 362 stations for several parameters: physical, chemical, biological, geological, And all this information was then compiled in more than 50 volumes, adding up to almost 30,000 pages. It had amazing photography, and it was also very, very known for the wonderful scientific illustrations. But that was a long time ago, and then we moved into past century. During the past century, we also had a really a lot of activities in that really represented the foundation for sustained multidisciplinary observations. And by multidisciplinary, I want to make emphasis in the inclusion of biological observations, which really came to be one of the last things that came into the observing system. So in this graph here, we have a compilation of different observing programs. There are more than 100 observing programs that are relatively active or have been active today at different scales, from small programs of less than 100 kilometers, 1 kilometer, to programs that are more than 1,000 kilometers. And we can see that at the beginning, in the early 1900s, there's almost very, very few programs operating, relatively small in scale. And when we turn to the 1950s, there's a steep, the curve starts to get much steeper, with then pretty much an exponential growth of programs. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you that these historical moments actually coincide with developments that took place in those times. So the CPR survey, for example, started in after 1925, and then in 1957 we have the establishment of SCORE, the Scientific Committee on Oceanic Research. A little bit later, the establishment of the Intergovernmental Oceanic Commission of UNESCO. In the 70s, the Cousteau team started exploring the seafloor and developing technologies that would allow us to go more into the ocean. Then in 1988, the establishment of GOOS, 1982, the establishment of the Global Climate Observing System, then POGO, the Partnership of the Observation of the Global Ocean, the establishment of the Ocean Ops Conferences, decadal 1999, the Census of Marine Life Program, and then the establishment of the GOOS BioEco Panel and the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. So these represent moments in time that increase the number of observations or the inclusion of multidisciplinary biological observations into the observing system. So all of this, in a way, led to discussions about how to have a really multidisciplinary observing system at the level of the Global Ocean Observing System of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. So the framework for ocean observing was proposed after discussions in Ocean Ops 09. And in 2012, this framework was proposed, in which we would have some measurement needs, that these should be some requirements. There were requirements for information. Then there was a process to observe what would respond to these requirements, generate outputs, which was the data and information products, which would generate an impact by delivering services to end users. So this input, you have a framework of essential ocean variables that are measured by the constellation of different technologies like ships, buoys, moorings, satellites, and other forms of platforms. Then they go to databases, and then they feed into the requirements. So the first step was then to identify what needs to be observed, which were the essential ocean variables. Within these multidisciplinary fields, which were the physical, the biochemical, and the biological variables. The physical variables were responsibility of the Ocean Observing Panel for Climate, the OOPC. The biochemical was the responsibility of the International Ocean Carbon Coordination Project. And for the biological variables, a new panel was established within the Global Ocean Observing System, which was the Biology and Ecosystem Panel. The variables are shown here and for each of the three different areas. And some of these were mostly defined by the requirements of the climate system, of issues with climate change and the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And for ocean variables, I will explain the process in a moment. But basically, what was suggested in this framework for ocean observing is that essential ocean variables should be targeted because they have a high impact and also a high feasibility. By high impact, we would say that these variables are relevant to solve science questions, but also to address societal needs, and at the same time contribute to improve management of marine resources. And feasibilities is what, well, they had to be scientifically credible, but also they had to be technically practical, that is cost effective and within human capabilities. That is, the technology that could measurement should already be in place, or at least close to being implemented. For biology, this was a little bit more complicated because we thought at the moment within the GOOS Biology and Ecosystem Panel that biological essential ocean variables should really address societal needs and be able to provide responses to global reporting commitments by the different countries. So with this model of drivers, pressure, state impact response, in which the drivers were the societal needs and the international obligations, and the pressures were those by humans on marine biodiversity and ecosystem health. We proposed this model, and we also put together, as you know, the state, how many programs are actually measuring these variables. And then we prioritize in terms of their feasibility and their impact on the UVs, and to initiate some solutions. So we were able to identify that there were several drivers, including sustainable economic growth, biodiversity conservation, access to data, environmental quality, threat and prevention mitigation, and so on. And there were several pressures, of which the loss of habitat, climate change, pollution, and coastal development were among the most pressing. So with these in mind, and then putting together with what is out there to actually measure, we came out with a series of biological essential ocean variables, which you can see below. Some of them are related to functional groups to study their diversity and biomass or the distribution and abundance, and others are related to habitat state. Next steps were to validate, integrate, and implement these within the current observing system, the existing observing system of just physical and biogeochemical variables to get a truly multidisciplinary system. The validation was done by, well, first getting the acceptance and the buy-in of the scientific community by publishing this on a scientific paper, but also by drafting technical specification sheets for each of those EOVs. Then we also validated this with the Global Climate Observing System, which has the framework of essential climate variables, in which then for the scientific area of the biosphere, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and then coral reefs, mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and macroalgal communities were considered to be essential climate variables. We also integrated these variables within the existing programs or regional programs and observing systems that were already working. And so I provide here an example with the the IMOS, the Integrated Marine Observing System of Australia, that was already measuring a few of these variables, with the US Integrated Ocean Observing System, or IOOS, and with the Southern Ocean Observing System, all of which, interestingly, are under different umbrellas, but there were coincidences with all of them. And the vision is really to standardize methods and data collection using FAIR principles. Continued integration, we also thought it was really important to bring other networks, like, for example, the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network within their marine different framework on essential biodiversity variables. So we would have the GOOSE program under the umbrella of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, and then we have the NPOM program under the umbrella of the Group on Earth Observations, both of which have a set of essential variables, one on ocean, one on biodiversity, all feeding into national, regional, global, and thematic networks. All of the data being integrated, ideally on the Ocean Biodiversity Information System and other national, international data system, feeding into data process providers and users like different actors within the United Nations for the World Ocean assessments and so forth. So that is that the data is then to support science and policy, and also to support capacity development and eventually contribute to the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Then the third step is implementation, to which we brought together different networks that were observing the different essential ocean variables as defined previously, and then putting together the people to work in drafting the specification sheets, and then integrating the networks with a common vision and mission based on needs and requirements, to study how much are the global capabilities and where are the gaps, what impact then they can generate, what sources of funding, and what governments they could possibly organize. So the global observing system, as we have it today, it's quite mature for physical and for some biogeochemical observations. We have the information streaming from the Argo floats, from deep floats, from biochemistry floats, the BioArgo, by gliders, by drifting buoys, and other systems that are in place. So this is what you see as a static map of data being generated by this system when you go to OceanOps. OceanOps also has a more interactive platform, which is this one that you see here, in which you can really zoom by area and see where the data for each of these points come from. But this is mostly, as I've mentioned before, for physical and biogeochemical variables, parameters. But for biology, thanks to our project supported by within the initiative of the Pegasus program for early stage grants advancing sustainability science, and or Pegasus, supported by Future Earth and the NCs and Colorado State University, we were able to put together and compile more than almost 600 databases. And these are now in this system, which is under test, under development, with 580 monitoring programs that are currently in this portal. So you will be able to filter by essential ocean variable and by area. So in summary, we have a system of different variables, physical, biogeochemical, biological, that are measured by a different set of technologies, platforms, or as for biology, by different networks and monitoring programs that ideally are feeding into both the OceanOps data portal and also to this BioEco data portal. So as we move to the next decade, I just wanted to briefly show a roadmap to achieve this multidisciplinary ocean observing system, because this is what has been done so far, but implementing this is, well, the next step and what is really desired. So when the Goose program developed its strategy, it defined around 11 major objectives within 3 areas, which were deepening engagement and impact, system integration and delivery, and building for the future. Within these 3 topics, there were 11 objectives, of which 4 were identified as priority objectives, which were both to achieve open data, to implement and promote best practices, to guide capacity development, and also to strengthen partnerships for delivery. So within keeping these priority objectives in mind, this roadmap to actually incorporate these biological observations into that observing system of buoys and moorings and all of those platforms, well, in the first place is to communicate and continue to communicate the value proposition across all stakeholders. And these would address, as we see here, color-coded, some of those priority objectives of the Goose strategy. The second is to strengthen the partnerships and develop leadership, not just across the network, but also establish a system of governance, which in the system that will help then maintain the coordination throughout the systems within all the stakeholders. Then build the foundation for the implementation by increasing resources, identifying best practices, making sure the data is fair, by building capacity, and also by developing metrics that will let us know what needs to be improved. Also to implement technological developments across, take advantage of the platforms that are already out there and incorporate new sensors that can at the same time measure different things, taking advantage of something that's already in the water. So these technologies may be novel, to try to aim for automation and for the calibration and quality control. Then to, of course, expand the network coverage, because as you saw in the maps before, there are many, many gaps. And this needs to be sustained in time, strengthened and expanded. And finally, to advance the use and impact of observations by operationalizing this, by feeding into policy assessment, and by increasing broadening participation. So actually, currently, the Scientific Committee on Oceanic Research, where I am actually working now, it's about advancing ocean sciences across disciplines and through international cooperation. And I have done this since 1957. SCORE is a really significant contributor to the Ocean Observing System, as it addresses global and multidisciplinary ocean issues. It plans and conducts research by establishing working groups and projects. It aims to solve methodological and conceptual problems, including the development of new technologies, developing capacity through different programs. It promotes equity, diversity, and inclusion in ocean sciences. And also it encourages and supports the involvement of students in early careers in any of these activities. Currently, SCORE has 5 research projects at large scale, 5 infrastructural projects also at the global scale, 18 active working groups. Historically, there have been more than 160, and capacity development activities. So I have marked with this blue globe those projects and working groups that actually contribute to the global observing system. And some of these are, of course, Geotraces, which is doing a baseline of marine biogeochemical trace elements and their isotopes in the ocean, and also the International Quiet Ocean Experiment, which is providing ocean soundscapes and the effects of sound on marine organisms. Within the infrastructure projects, we have the International Ocean Carbon Coordination Project, which is pretty much the biogeochemistry panel, the Southern Ocean Observing System, the Global Harmful Algal Blooms project. And within working groups, there are several groups working on atmosphere issues, on seagrasses, on plankton, and on temperature that actually provide data for the observing system. SCORE is also contributing to the UN Ocean Decade. One of the challenges and priorities of the decade is actually to provide, to strengthening the observing system and provide data. So there are several groups within SCORE that actually have activities that have been endorsed by the UN Decade. Some of them are the working group OASIS, which is developing observing air-sea interaction strategy, GeoTraces, which I mentioned before, the Deep Sea Decade project, which is a working group which is actually leading to the Challenger 150, which is a deep sea program. The IOCCP is contributing to 5 UN Decade endorsed projects, mostly on ocean observations, oxygen and acidification. The Southern Ocean Observing System has been endorsed by its roadmap for strengthening links between science, policy, and industry. IMBER, the Integrated Marine Biosphere Research, has summer schools that have been endorsed as UN activities, and so forth. So all of this information, you can find it on the SCORE website. So finally, I would really like to acknowledge everyone and invite you to collaborate and engage in SCORE projects and in working groups or propose new working groups, and also to get engaged in capacity development activities, not just for ocean science, but specifically in what concerns this session, which is about contributing to this multidisciplinary ocean observing system. So thank you very much, and that's all I have to say to you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. So I think, again, please post any questions you have directly to one of the speakers into the chat, but we have time now to go through any question you might have in general or to any of the speakers earlier in the session. I kind of try to spark you with this question about the value chain and the challenges throughout the value chain, and what are the, maybe I'm going to get into the light. Here we are. And what are the enablers? I mean, we heard about, you know, the funding requirements. We heard about the need for cooperation and bringing things together. And I think this is nothing less than an invitation to actually reach out to what you have heard today, and reach out to the programs that you have heard that might be relevant to you. And of course, those programs also communicate with each other. I mean, this is a network of networks in that sense, and a system of systems. So there's a lot of communication going on, and still we have a lot of these challenges. And that partly are related to the fact that, and I think that was a very strong message in relation to, it's all great what we are doing, but we're doing it kind of on a shoestring, and there's no sustained funding for a lot of the things. There might be a lot of money put into the observing systems directly, but it's not sustained. But how much money is actually being given to make the data available? I mean, there was this pledge to think about, you know, not think about, but just do it, take the data, make it available. But there was also the point made by the fact that a lot of the funding schemes do not necessarily have a lot of funding allocated to exactly that, making the data available. And I think that is something we also see in other areas, that there's often a lot of data for the immediate observation and the immediate analysis of the data, but not necessarily for making the data available in the long term. So I would open it to all of you to see whether there is any interest for discussion, questions, or if you are all very tired and hungry. Let's see. Yes, Lisa. Maybe you can switch the light on again. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't hear all the talks in this session, so this question might be off target, but what I did hear is these wonderful, amazing ecosystem-based observational programs that focus only on, mainly on the water column, and don't have a bottom and don't have bottom observations. I know there are some long-term bottom monitoring, but they seem to be very separate. And I just wondered, you know, what are the opportunities to integrate the seafloor and the water column, since they're really connected, and in many cases they do matter for fisheries.
Very true. Does anyone want to respond to that? Any observing system present in the room that wants to?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. It's an important point, and we do in IMOS we do have some benthic observing. We also support a program called Reef Life Survey, which puts divers in the water to do coral surveys and fish surveys as an integrated package. So we do try to bring as many of those different elements together. We don't, however, do bathymetry. And we don't do that because we have another agency in Australia, Geoscience Australia, who it's in their sort of core business to collect those data. So what we have to do is leverage off of each other. I think the reality is we're never going to have enough money to do all of the things we could do or even the things we should do. So we have to start working together to take advantage of the funding other groups have and see how we can put as many pieces together as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to write on Dillard's. Dylan talk. So I'd like your analogy with this grain depository up to north. And I was very pleased to see you mention World Ocean Database on your first slide, since I'm working on it for 19 years. So I would say the World Ocean Database, it for me looks like this data repository, whatever. And if your data came to World Ocean Database, it will be safe forever, I hope. So I encourage you all to think about it, to submitting your data to us, and we will not ask you for money to deal with data. We will keep them, store them, and we will use them in our product, World Ocean Atlas, or high-resolution regional climatologies, which you can use for your model needs. If you need the model fields, or you can use data, and it's all public domain. So do not hesitate and give us your data.
Thank you for the pledge. Give us all your data. So are there more points to be made in this audience? I think it's also another very interesting, I just continue talking. If you don't talk, I talk. No worries, I can talk for quite a long time. I don't want to hold you longer than necessary, but just one point, going also again like this, you know, the benthic observation, I think Lisa was also alluding a little bit to the fact that, I mean, how far do we actually go into the deep? And at some point, we have really few observations only. However, there's of course developments like deep sea mining. Okay, this is a bit of a contentious topic here, but there are increased requirements that are coming in that do require that we actually carry out observations to know what is down there, to be able to have a proper management of the systems and or the proper management of the activities that are to be carried out in these areas. And then maybe that is also something, and I go to you in a second, but that maybe is also something where, and it has been mentioned in some of the talks, kind of linking the physical, chemical, biological indicators with social indicators to show the relevance of some of the observations and maybe all of the observations that we're making. There's a lot of course, science interest, and we need more data. We want to have a better analysis. We want to have a better calculation of the heat budget of the ocean because it's relevant for climate modeling. So it's a very indirect use of the data in terms of societal relevance. But a lot of the programs, and I mean, you have been showing that a lot of the data or the data products are of immediate use. So there is actually this use case that we can show to prove that all the effort that has been put into is actually of a great benefit directly to specific sectors, but then at large also to society. So, Robert.
Yeah, so this is related to yours and Lisa's comments. And the supply line, I missed probably your talk about that. So in my experience with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill impact assessment was that there were no really good previous assessments of the seabed at that level before the impact. So tying in, like, it's good to have these observations before things happen or before we have industry moving into deep sea. So that might be more argument for incorporating these types of benthic things into these observation networks.
Thank you. I think that's a really relevant point. I mean, we talk about the precautionary principle often, but one part of this precautionary principle is that we do need to know what is out there to be able to assess when something happens. That's very true. That, of course, creates a challenge of we need to know far more, because most of the areas we do not know anything about. So that's of course a challenge in itself. Are there more questions, comments from? Yes, Dylan, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of re-bring up the idea that we have really large data sets, and I think this kind of conference is a perfect time to have these conversations and have workshops, working groups, where we have leaders from different institutions in all of these different countries kind of get together and say, okay, how are we going to plan for our future and make space, both money and time for these big data efforts. And we have groups, the model intercomparison projects, CMIP 5 and 6, that provide huge data sets, and there are people who've dealt with these issues, and maybe some of them are here. The FishMIP group uses these outputs, and so we have a lot of we can leverage people from all kinds of different sort of aspects to really make a lot of progress in this sort of field at conferences like this. So I just wanted to flag that.
Thank you very much. Any direct reflection on that? Otherwise, there is actually a point from one of the co-conveners, we are in contact, in relation to the point that I kind of made when I said, well, we are looking into physical, chemical, biological observations, but we also saw that, of course, that integration in itself is already a challenge when it comes to making that integration available for management, because sometimes it's very siloed use of those kinds of information or data. So maybe, I don't know, Michelle, from your experience, I mean, what are how can we do better maybe, or what is your experience, and maybe you have examples where that actually works.
I think it's a challenge for multiple reasons. One being exactly that we have these silos. We have groups of people who work on very similar things and never speak to each other. We have groups of people who work on different things and don't speak a common language, so to speak, so they have a hard time understanding where the other one is coming from. So I think it then falls on people who work across these sectors and thinking about being multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary and being the glue or the translator between these groups. And so we've been looking at this and thinking about it quite a lot in IMOS. I'm a biologist by background. The getting things in and out of MATLAB is not in my skill set. That's where all the oceanographers tend to work. So finding ways that we can get the oceanographic data into R and into Python where biologists can use it is one simple step, but then also going a step further and creating the integrated data sets where the biological data is actually matched up with the corresponding physical data that we have means that people can then pick it up and use it much more rapidly. So we're trying to work towards those things, but you have to know what people need as well. We can't do everything for everyone, and we can't guess what are the priority things. So there's a lot of conversations that have to happen as well to find out where is it worth putting your energy and effort to make sure that you're delivering things that are meaningful.
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, there are more comments to that. Running. You want to go first and then Erin?
Hi, Jan Newton, University of Washington. Maybe it's because it's day 6, I'm tired, but also I feel like, I think this discussion's been really rich about seeing the positives, but also the lacking, and linking to the benthos. And we have these really cool ocean observing systems. I'm a director for NANUS, which is one of the USIUS regional ocean observing systems for the Pacific Northwest. And we have so many unmet needs, but with level budgets, it's really difficult. And I was so inspired by Michelle's talk this morning about when Magic asked her, like, why is IMOS so good? And you really hit on the human element of that, and that people are partnering and people are coming to that with how can I help? And so as I'm here listening to, like, needs for better data discovery, so well articulated by Dylan, needs for linking to the deep ocean, so well articulated by Lisa. I just want to put the plea out there that it is really people who do this, and the more we can lift each other collectively up, and like my head is snapping because here I'm proud of NANUS's 20 years, and yet now there's MCDR and there's offshore wind farms, and we're going to need to respond to that, and I don't know how to get that done. So like I said, I'm feeling tired at the end of the week, but I just was so inspired by what Michelle said, and just like, this is a really great group here. And Peter Thompson on Twitter, which I never look at, but I was sitting next to Katarina Shu and I saw it. He says, we need to invest in ocean science like we've never invested before. Well, I hope his plea comes true, but I do know, regardless of what dollars get invested, it's going to be the people. So thanks, Michelle, for your inspiration.
Thank you. Erin, you wanted to come in?
If there's time, you can go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. It's hard to follow. I mean, the people, yes. I was going to circle back, and I think it ties in some ways to kind of the human personnel, is the connecting to social indicators and observations. I think one thing that we've been working on is actually doing more of a landscape analysis of what are the existing social indicators that are being used, and then how can you look at what ecosystem or ecological variables then can directly link to those. And I think, at least what I find, and this was something that came up in a recent presentation about this, is sometimes those variables that are extremely important but aren't directly linked to things start to fall on the wayside. So it's almost requires then trying to have this broader view, but also prioritizing. And I don't know, this isn't really more of a comment, that I find it hard to figure out that balance of the trade-offs of what do you focus on, because there are these limited resources, and do you focus on just those direct connections or the entire chain of indirect and direct events? So I guess putting that to the group, but I'm curious.
Thank you. Anyone who wants to come in? We're getting close to the end of the session. And it's always a challenge, because, I mean, one thing that happens, of course, during these sessions and is that we all learn. I hope that we all learn. I definitely learn. I know so little that I always learn something. Okay, well, but the point is always like, what now? We had this beautiful session and we had this exchange, and maybe, you know, some of us take things back home, and maybe we already have new links and new communication, new dialogues, bringing people in, bringing people together. And I think that is, of course, one of the main goals of these sessions is, you know, bringing out ideas and bringing together the people. And I think that's very well said. I mean, in the end, it's people. The good thing about human beings is that we can talk to each other. The bad thing is that we sometimes don't do that because we are human beings. So it's challenging. I would think, going back to this, how can we actually bring forward specific recommendations to, you know, to really strengthen these challenges that we've seen? But we also identified, okay, so we can do something if we would, you know, do A, B, C, and bring that forward. I hope that might spark also some cooperation in bringing together a scientific paper for all of the scientists among us that need to publish for their career, but also being able to translate that into the existing frameworks where we can communicate to the ones that need to hear that in relation to making decisions on the funding and making decisions on the decisions to be taken out of those observations, the data products. So with that, I thank you all for the very good discussion. All the speakers of today, the 3 invited speakers, all the contributed speakers, and the conveners in online, and just see that there is something Oh, Jan said it. Okay, well, that's good. Yes. We think very much alike, the conveners and the rest of the conveners and I. Thank my co-conveners in helped and or actually mostly organized this whole session, brought everyone together, and I wish you a great rest of the conference. There's not much left, but a little bit is left, and I hope that you found new colleagues, new friends, made new connections, and wish you all a safe travel back home. For those who are living in Bergen, it's a very short travel, but for some of you, it's probably a very long travel. So thank you very much, and see you later.